At the Earth's Core, by Edgar Rice Burroughs, as published in All Story Weekly in a 4-part serial from April 4th to April 25th in 1914. At the Earth's Core was first published in book form in hardcover in 1922. At the Earth's Core is the first of 7 books in the Pellucidar series. DC Comics published a comic book adaptation, and a movie adaptation of At the Earth's Core was released in 1976. The world of Pellucidar makes several appearances in Burroughs' Tarzan series as well. During the initial explorations of Lechuguilla Cave in New Mexico, a chamber was named Pellucidar in honor of these stories. Let's join David Innes and Abner Perry as they embark on this incredible journey. Prologue. In the first place, please bear in mind that I do not expect you to believe this story. Nor could you wonder had you witnessed a recent experience of mine when, in the armor of blissful and stupendous ignorance, I gaily narrated the gist of it to a fellow of the Royal Geological Society on the occasion of my last trip to London. You would surely have thought that I had been detected in no less a heinous crime than the purloining of the crown jewels from the Tower, or putting poison in the coffee of His Majesty the King. The erudite gentleman in whom I confided congealed before I was half through. It is all that saved him from exploding, and my dreams of an honorary fellowship, gold medals, and a niche in the Hall of Fame faded into the thin, cold air of his Arctic atmosphere. But I believe the story, and so would you, and so would the learned fellow of the Royal Geological Society. Had you, and he heard it from the lips of the man who told it to me? Had you seen, as I did, the fire of truth in those grey eyes? Had you felt the ring of sincerity in that quiet voice? Had you realized the pathos of it all? You, too, would believe. You would not have needed the final ocular proof that I had, the weird, ramphor, Hincus-like creature which he had brought back with him from the inner world. I came upon him quite suddenly, and no less unexpectedly, upon the rim of the great Sahara Desert. He was standing before a goatskin tent amidst a clump of date palms within a tiny oasis. Close by was an Arab douar of some 8 or 10 tents. I had come down from the north to hunt lion. My party consisted of a dozen children of the desert. I was the only white man. As we approached the little clump of verdure, I saw the man come from his tent and, with hand-shaded eyes, peer intently at us. At sight of me, he advanced rapidly to meet us. "A white man!" he cried. "May the good Lord be praised! I've been watching you for hours, hoping against hope that this time there would be a white man. Tell me the date! What year is it?" And when I had told him, he staggered as though he had been struck full in the face, so that he was compelled to grasp my stirrup leather for support. "It cannot be," he cried after a moment. "It cannot be. Tell me that you are mistaken, or that you are but joking." "I am telling you the truth, my friend," I replied. "Why should I deceive a stranger or attempt to in so simple a matter as the date?" For some time he stood in silence with bowed head. 10 years, he murmured at last. 10 years, and I thought that at the most it could be scarce more than 1. That night he told me his story, the story that I give you here as nearly in his own words as I can recall them. Chapter 1. Toward the Eternal Fire. I was born in Connecticut about 30 years ago. My name is David Innes. My father was a wealthy mine owner. When I was 19, he died. All his property was to be mine when I had attained my majority, provided that I had devoted the 2 years intervening in close application to the great business I was to inherit. I did my best to fulfill the last wishes of my parent, not because of the inheritance, but because I loved and honored my father. For 6 months I toiled in the mines and in the counting rooms, for I wished to know every minute detail of the business. Then Perry interested me in his invention. He was an old fellow who had devoted the better part of a long life to the perfection of a mechanical subterranean prospector. As relaxation, he studied paleontology. I looked over his plans, listened to his arguments, inspected his working model, and then, convinced, I advanced the funds necessary to construct a full-sized practical prospector. I shall not go into the details of its construction. It lies out there in the desert now, about 2 miles from here. Tomorrow you may care to ride out and see it. Roughly, it is a steel cylinder 100 feet long and jointed so that it may turn and twist through solid rock if need be. At one end is a mighty revolving drill operated by an engine which Perry said generated more power to the cubic inch than any other engine did to the cubic foot. I remember that he used to claim that invention alone would make us fabulously wealthy. We were going to make the whole thing public after the successful issue of our first secret trial, but Perry never returned from that trial trip, and I only after 10 years. I recall, as it were, but yesterday the night of that momentous occasion upon which we were to test the practicality of that wondrous invention. It was near midnight when we repaired to the lofty tower in which Perry had constructed his iron mole, as he was wont to call the thing. The great nose rested upon the bare earth of the floor. We passed through the doors into the outer jacket, secured them, and then, passing on into the cabin, which contained the controlling mechanism within the inner tube, switched on the electric lights. Perry looked to his generator, to the great tanks that held the life-giving chemicals with which he was to manufacture fresh air to replace that which we consumed in breathing, to his instruments for recording temperatures, speed, distance, and for examining the materials through which we were to pass. He tested the steering device and overlooked the mighty cogs which transmitted its marvelous velocity to the giant drill at the nose of his strange craft. Our seats, into which we strapped ourselves, were so arranged upon transverse bars that we would be upright whether the craft were ploughing her way downward into the bowels of the earth, or running horizontally along some great seam of coal, or rising vertically toward the surface again. At length all was ready. Perry bowed his head in prayer. For a moment we were silent, and then the old man's hand grasped the starting lever. There was a frightful roaring beneath us. The giant frame trembled and vibrated. There was a rush of sound as the loose earth passed up through the hollow space between the inner and outer jackets to be deposited in our wake. We were off. The noise was deafening. The sensation was frightful. For a full minute, neither of us could do aught but cling with the proverbial desperation of the drowning man to the handrails of our swinging seats. Then Perry glanced at the thermometer. "Gad!" he cried. "It cannot be possible! Quick! What does the distance meter read?" That and the speedometer were both on my side of the cabin, and as I turned to take a reading from the former, I could see Perry muttering. 10 degrees rise. It cannot be possible! And then I saw him tug frantically upon the steering wheel. As I finally found the tiny needle in the dim light, I translated Perry's evident excitement, and my heart sank within me. But when I spoke, I hid the fear which haunted me. "It will be 700 feet, Perry," I said, "by the time you can turn her into the horizontal." "You'd better lend me a hand then, my boy," he replied, "for I cannot budge her out of the vertical alone. God give that our combined strength may be equal to the task, for else we are lost." I wormed my way to the old man's side, with never a doubt but the great wheel would yield on the instant to the power of my young and vigorous muscles, nor was my belief mere vanity, for always had my physique been the envy and despair of my fellows, and for that very reason it had waxed even greater than nature had intended, since my natural pride in my great strength had led me to care for and develop my body and my muscles by every means within my power. What with boxing, football, and baseball, I had been in training since childhood. And so it was with the utmost confidence that I laid hold of the huge iron rim, but though I threw every ounce of my strength into it, my best effort was as unavailing as Perry's had been. The thing would not budge. The grim, insensate, horrible thing that was holding us upon the straight road to death. At length I gave up the useless struggle, and without a word returned to my seat. There was no need for words, at least none that I could imagine, unless Perry desired to pray. And I was quite sure that he would, for he never left an opportunity neglected where he might sandwich in a prayer. He prayed when he arose in the morning, he prayed before he ate, he prayed when he had finished eating, and before he went to bed at night he prayed again. In between, he often found excuses to pray, even when the provocation seemed far-fetched to my worldly eyes. Now that he was about to die, I felt positive that I should witness a perfect orgy of prayer, if one may allude with such a simile to so solemn an act. But to my astonishment, I discovered that with death staring him in the face, Abner Perry was transformed into a new being. From his lips there flowed, not prayer, but a clear and limpid stream of undiluted profanity, and it was all directed at that quietly stubborn piece of unyielding mechanism. "I should think, Perry," I chided, "that a man of your professed religiousness would rather be at his prayers than cursing in the presence of imminent death." "Death!" he cried. "Death is it that appalls you? That is nothing by comparison with the loss the world must suffer." "Why, David? Within this iron cylinder we have demonstrated possibilities that science has scarce dreamed. We have harnessed a new principle and with it animated a piece of steel with the power of 10,000 men. That 2 lives will be snuffed out is nothing to the world calamity that entombs in the bowels of the earth the discoveries that I have made and proved in the successful construction of the thing that is now carrying us farther and farther toward the eternal central fires." I am frank to admit that, for myself, I was much more concerned with our own immediate future than with any problematic loss which the world might be about to suffer. The world was at least ignorant of its bereavement, while to me it was a real and terrible actuality. "What can we do?" I asked, hiding my perturbation beneath the mask of a low and level voice. "We may stop here and die of asphyxiation when our atmospheres are empty," replied Perry, "or we may continue on with the slight hope that we may later sufficiently deflect the prospector from the vertical to carry us along the arc of a great circle which must eventually return us to the surface. If we succeed in so doing before we reach the higher internal temperature, we may even yet survive. There would seem to me to be about 1 chance in several million that we shall succeed. Otherwise, we shall die more quickly, but no more surely than as though we sat supinely waiting for the torture of a slow and horrible death." I glanced at the thermometer. It registered 110 degrees. While we were talking, the mighty iron mole had bored its way over a mile into the rock of the earth's crust. "Let us continue on, then," I replied. "It should soon be over at this rate. You never intimated that the speed of this thing would be so high, Perry. Didn't you know it?" "No," he answered. "I could not figure the speed exactly, for I had no instrument for measuring the mighty power of my generator. I reasoned, however, that we should make about 500 yards an hour." "And we are making 7 miles an hour," I concluded for him as I sat with my eyes upon the distance meter. "How thick is the Earth's crust, Perry?" I asked. "There are almost as many conjectures as to that as there are geologists," was his answer. "One estimates it 30 miles because the internal heat, increasing at the rate of about 1 degree to each 60 to 70 feet depth, would be sufficient to fuse the most refractory substances at that distance beneath the surface. Another finds that the phenomena of precession and nutation require that the Earth, if not entirely solid, must at least have a shell not less than 800 to 1,000 miles in thickness. So there you are. You may take your choice." "And if it should prove solid?" I asked. "It will be all the same to us in the end, David," replied Perry. "At the best, our fuel will suffice to carry us but 3 or 4 days, while our atmosphere cannot last to exceed 3. Neither, then, is sufficient to bear us in safety through 8,000 miles of rock to the antipodes. If the crust is of sufficient thickness, we shall come to a final stop between 600 and 700 miles beneath the Earth's surface, but during the last 150 miles of our journey we shall be corpses. Am I correct?" I asked. "Quite correct, David. Are you frightened?" "I do not know. It all has come so suddenly that I scarce believe that either of us realizes the real terrors of our position. I feel that I should be reduced to panic, but yet I am not. I imagine that the shock has been so great as to partially stun our sensibilities." Again I turned to the thermometer. The mercury was rising with less rapidity. It was now but 140 degrees, although we had penetrated to a depth of nearly 4 miles. I told Perry, and he smiled. "We have shattered one theory at least," was his only comment, and then he returned to his self-assumed occupation of fluently cursing the steering wheel. I once heard a pirate swear, but his best efforts would have seemed like those of a tyro alongside of Perry's masterful and scientific imprecations. Once more I tried my hand at the wheel, but I might as well have essayed to swing the earth itself. At my suggestion, Perry stopped the generator, and as we came to rest, I again threw all my strength into a supreme effort to move the thing even a hair's breadth, but the results were as barren as when we had been travelling at top speed. I shook my head sadly and motioned to the starting lever. Perry pulled it toward him, and once again we were plunging downward toward eternity at the rate of 7 miles an hour. I sat with my eyes glued to the thermometer and the distance meter. The mercury was rising very slowly now, though even at 145 degrees it was almost unbearable within the narrow confines of our metal prison. About noon, or 12 hours after our start upon this unfortunate journey, we had bored to a depth of 84 miles, at which point the mercury registered 153 degrees F. Perry was becoming more hopeful, although upon what meagre food he sustained his optimism I could not conjecture. From cursing, he had turned to singing. I felt that the strain had at last affected his mind. For several hours we had not spoken, except as he asked me for the readings of the instruments from time to time, and I announced them. My thoughts were filled with vain regrets. I recalled numerous acts of my past life, which I should have been glad to have had a few more years to live down. There was the affair in the Latin Commons at Andover, when Calhoun and I had put gunpowder in the stove and nearly killed one of the masters. And then, but what was the use? I was about to die and atone for all these things and several more. Already the heat was sufficient to give me a foretaste of the hereafter. A few more degrees, and I felt that I should lose consciousness. "What are the readings now, David?" Perry's voice broke in upon my somber reflections. 90 miles and 153 degrees, I replied. "Gad, but we've knocked that 30-mile crust theory into a cocked hat!" he cried gleefully. "Precious lot of good it will do us," I growled back. "But, my boy," he continued, "doesn't that temperature reading mean anything to you? Why, it hasn't gone up in 6 miles. Think of it, son." "Yes, I'm thinking of it," I answered. "But what difference will it make when our air supply is exhausted, whether the temperature is 153 degrees or 153,000? We'll be just as dead, and no one will know the difference anyhow." But I must admit that for some unaccountable reason the stationary temperature did renew my waning hope. What I hoped for I could not have explained, nor did I try. The very fact, as Perry took pains to explain, of the blasting of several very exact and learned scientific hypotheses made it apparent that we could not know what lay before us within the bowels of the earth, and so we might continue to hope for the best, at least until we were dead, when hope would no longer be essential to our happiness. It was very good and logical reasoning, and so I embraced it. At 100 miles, the temperature had dropped to 152½ degrees. When I announced it, Perry reached over and hugged me. From then on until noon of the second day, it continued to drop until it became as uncomfortably cold as it had been unbearably hot before. At the depth of 240 miles, our nostrils were assailed by almost overpowering ammonia fumes, and the temperature had dropped to 10 below zero. We suffered nearly 2 hours of this intense and bitter cold until at about 245 miles from the surface of the earth we entered a stratum of solid ice, when the mercury quickly rose to 32 degrees. During the next 3 hours, we passed through 10 miles of ice, eventually emerging into another series of ammonia-impregnated strata, where the mercury again fell to 10 degrees below zero. Slowly it rose once more until we were convinced that at last we were nearing the molten interior of the earth. At 400 miles, the temperature had reached 153 degrees. Feverishly, I watched the thermometer. Slowly it rose. Perry had ceased singing and was at last praying. Our hopes had received such a death blow that the gradually increasing heat seemed to our distorted imaginations much greater than it really was. For another hour I saw that pitiless column of mercury rise and rise until at 410 miles it stood at 153 degrees. Now it was that we began to hang upon those readings in almost breathless anxiety. 153 degrees had been the maximum temperature above the ice stratum. Would it stop at this point again, or would it continue its merciless climb? We knew that there was no hope, and yet, with the persistence of life itself, we continued to hope against practical certainty. Already the air tanks were at low ebb. There was barely enough of the precious gases to sustain us for another 12 hours. But would we be alive to know or care? It seemed incredible. At 420 miles, I took another reading. "Perry!" I shouted. "Perry, man, she's going down! She's going down! She's 152 degrees again!" "Gad!" he cried. "What can it mean? Can the earth be cold at the center?" "I do not know, Perry," I answered. "But thank God, if I am to die, it shall not be by fire. That is all that I have feared. I can face the thought of any death but that. Down? Down went the mercury until it stood as low as it had 7 miles from the surface of the earth. Then of a sudden the realization broke upon us that death was very near. Perry was the first to discover it. I saw him fussing with the valves that regulate the air supply, and at the same time I experienced difficulty in breathing. My head felt dizzy, my limbs heavy. I saw Perry crumple in his seat. He gave himself a shake and sat erect again. Then he turned toward me. "Goodbye, David," he said. "I guess this is the end." And then he smiled and closed his eyes. "Goodbye, Perry, and good luck to you," I answered, smiling back at him. But I fought off that awful lethargy. I was very young. I did not want to die. For an hour I battled against the cruelly enveloping death that surrounded me on all sides. At first I found that by climbing high into the framework above me, I could find more of the precious life-giving elements, and for a while these sustained me. It must have been an hour after Perry had succumbed that I at last came to the realization that I could no longer carry on this unequal struggle against the inevitable. With my last flickering ray of consciousness, I turned mechanically toward the distance meter. It stood at exactly 500 miles from the Earth's surface, and then of a sudden the huge thing that bore us came to a stop. The rattle of hurtling rock through the hollow jacket ceased. The wild racing of the giant drill betokened that it was running loose in air. And then another truth flashed upon me. The point of the prospector was above us. Slowly it dawned on me that since passing through the ice strata, it had been above. We had turned in the ice and sped upward toward the Earth's crust. Thank God! We were safe. I put my nose to the intake pipe through which samples would have been taken during the passage of the prospector through the Earth, and my fondest hopes were realized. A flood of fresh air was pouring into the iron cabin. The reaction left me in a state of collapse, and I lost consciousness. Chapter 2. A Strange World. I was unconscious little more than an instant, for as I lunged forward from the crossbeam to which I had been clinging and fell with a crash to the floor of the cabin, the shock brought me to myself. My first concern was with Perry. I was horrified at the thought that upon the very threshold of salvation he might be dead. Tearing open his shirt, I placed my ear to his breast. I could have cried with relief. His heart was beating quite regularly. At the water tank, I wetted my handkerchief, slapping it smartly across his forehead and face several times. In a moment, I was rewarded by the raising of his lids. For a time, he lay wide-eyed and quite uncomprehending. Then his scattered wits slowly foregathered, and he sat up, sniffing the air with an expression of wonderment upon his face. "Why, David," he cried at last, "it's air, as sure as I live!" "Why? Why, what does it mean? Where in the world are we? What has happened?" "It means that we're back at the surface, all right, Perry," I cried. "But where, I don't know. I haven't opened her up yet. Been too busy reviving you. Lord, man, but you had a close squeak." "You say we're back at the surface, David. How can that be? How long have I been unconscious?" "Not long. We turned in the ice stratum. Don't you recall the sudden whirling of our seats? After that, The drill was above you instead of below. We didn't notice it at the time, but I recall it now." "You mean to say that we turned back in the ice stratum, David? That is not possible. The prospector cannot turn unless its nose is deflected from the outside by some external force or resistance. The steering wheel within would have moved in response. The steering wheel has not budged, David, since we started. You know that." I did know it, but here we were with our drill racing in pure air and copious volumes of it pouring into the cabin. "We couldn't have turned in the ice stratum, Perry, I know as well as you," I replied. "But the fact remains that we did, for here we are this minute at the surface of the earth again, and I am going out to see just where." "Better wait till morning, David. It must be midnight now." I glanced at the chronometer. 12:30. We have been out 72 hours, so it must be midnight. Nevertheless, I am going to have a look at the blessed sky that I had given up all hope of ever seeing again. And so saying, I lifted the bars from the inner door and swung it open. There was quite a quantity of loose material in the jacket, and this I had to remove with a shovel to get at the opposite door in the outer shell. In a short time, I had removed enough of the earth and rock to the floor of the cabin to expose the door beyond. Perry was directly behind me as I threw it open. The upper half was above the surface of the ground. With an expression of surprise, I turned and looked at Perry. It was broad daylight without. "Something seems to have gone wrong either with our calculations or the chronometer," I said. Perry shook his head. There was a strange expression in his eyes. "Let's have a look beyond that door, David," he cried. Together we stepped out to stand in silent contemplation of a landscape at once weird and beautiful. Before us, a low and level shore stretched down to a silent sea. As far as the eye could reach, the surface of the water was dotted with countless tiny isles, some of towering, barren, granitic rock, others resplendent in gorgeous trappings of tropical vegetation, myriad starred with the magnificent splendor of vivid blooms. Behind us rose a dark and forbidding wood of giant arborescent ferns intermingled with the commoner types of a primeval tropical forest. Huge creepers depended in great loops from tree to tree. Dense underbrush overgrew a tangled mass of fallen trunks and branches. Upon the outer verge we could see the same splendid colouring of countless blossoms that glorified the islands, but within the dense shadows all seemed dark and gloomy as the grave, and upon all the noonday sun poured its torrid rays out of a cloudless sky. "Where on earth can we be?" I asked, turning to Perry. For some moments the old man did not reply. He stood with bowed head, buried in deep thought, but at last he spoke. "David," he said, "I am not so sure that we are on earth." "What do you mean, Perry?" I cried. "Do you think that we are dead and this is heaven?" He smiled and, turning, pointed to the nose of the prospector protruding from the ground at our backs. "But for that, David, I might believe that we were indeed come to the country beyond the sticks. The prospector renders that theory untenable. It certainly could never have gone to heaven. However, I am willing to concede that we actually may be in another world from that which we have always known. If we are not on earth, there is every reason to believe that we may be in it. We may have quartered through the earth's crust and come out upon some tropical island of the West Indies," I suggested. Again Perry shook his head. "Let us wait and see, David," he replied. "And in the meantime, suppose we do a bit of exploring up and down the coast. We may find a native who can enlighten us." As we walked along the beach, Perry gazed long and earnestly across the water. Evidently, he was wrestling with a mighty problem. "David," he said abruptly, "do you perceive anything unusual about the horizon?" As I looked, I began to appreciate the reason for the strangeness of the landscape that had haunted me from the first with an elusive suggestion of the bizarre and unnatural. There was no horizon! As far as the eye could reach, the sea continued, and upon its bosom floated tiny islands, those in the distance reduced to mere specks, but ever beyond them was the sea, until the impression became quite real that one was looking up at the most distant point that the eyes could fathom. The distance was lost in the distance. That was all. There was no clear-cut horizontal line marking the dip of the globe below the line of vision. "A great light is commencing to break on me," continued Perry, taking out his watch. "I believe that I have partially solved the riddle. It is now 2 o'clock. When we emerged from the prospector, the sun was directly above us. Where is it now?" I glanced up to find the great orb still motionless in the center of the heaven. And such a sun! I had scarcely noticed it before. Fully thrice the size of the sun I had known throughout my life, and apparently so near that the sight of it carried the conviction that one might almost reach up and touch it. "My God, Perry, where are we?" I exclaimed. "This thing is beginning to get on my nerves." "I think that I may state quite positively, David," he commenced, "that we are," but he got no further. From behind us, in the vicinity of the prospector, there came the most thunderous, awe-inspiring roar that ever had fallen upon my ears. With one accord we turned to discover the author of that fearsome noise. Had I still retained the suspicion that we were on earth, the sight that met my eyes would quite entirely have banished it. Emerging from the forest was a colossal beast that closely resembled a bear. It was fully as large as the largest elephant, and with great forepaws armed with huge claws. Its nose or snout depended nearly a foot below its lower jaw, much after the manner of a rudimentary trunk. The giant body was covered by a coat of thick, shaggy hair. Roaring horribly, it came toward us at a ponderous, shuffling trot. I turned to Perry to suggest that it might be wise to seek other surroundings. The idea had evidently occurred to Perry previously, for he was already 100 paces away, and with each second his prodigious bounds increased the distance. I had never guessed what latent speed possibilities the old gentleman possessed. I saw that he was headed toward a little point of the forest which ran out toward the sea not far from where we had been standing, and as the mighty creature, the sight of which had galvanized him into such remarkable action, was forging steadily toward me, I set off after Perry, though at a somewhat more decorous pace. It was evident that the massive beast pursuing us was not built for speed, so all that I considered necessary was to gain the trees sufficiently ahead of it to enable me to climb to the safety of some great branch before it came up. Notwithstanding our danger, I could not help but laugh at Perry's frantic capers as he essayed to gain the safety of the lower branches of the trees he now had reached. The stems were bare for a distance of some 15 feet, at least on those trees which Perry attempted to ascend, for the suggestion of safety carried by the larger of the forest giants had evidently attracted him to them. A dozen times he scrambled up the trunks like a huge cat, only to fall back to the ground once more, and with each failure he cast a horrified glance over his shoulder at the oncoming brute, simultaneously emitting terror-stricken shrieks that awoke the echoes of the grim forest. At length he spied a dangling creeper about the bigness of one's wrist, and when I reached the trees, he was racing madly up it, hand over hand. He had almost reached the lowest branch of the tree from which the creeper depended when the thing parted beneath his weight, and he fell sprawling at my feet. The misfortune now was no longer amusing, for the beast was already too close to us for comfort. Seizing Perry by the shoulder, I dragged him to his feet, and rushing to a smaller tree, one that he could easily encircle with his arms and legs, I boosted him as far up as I could, and then left him to his fate, for a glance over my shoulder revealed the awful beast almost upon me. It was the great size of the thing alone that saved me. Its enormous bulk rendered it too slow upon its feet to cope with the agility of my young muscles, and so I was enabled to dodge out of its way and run completely behind it before its slow wits could direct it in pursuit. The few seconds of grace that this gave me found me safely lodged in the branches of a tree, a few paces from that in which Perry had at last found a haven. Did I say safely lodged? At the time, I thought we were quite safe, and so did Perry. He was praying, raising his voice in thanksgiving at our deliverance, and had just completed a sort of paean of gratitude that the thing couldn't climb a tree when, without warning, it reared up beneath him on its enormous tail and hind feet, and reached those fearfully armed paws quite to the branch upon which he crouched. The accompanying roar was all but drowned in Perry's scream of fright, and he came near, tumbling headlong into the gaping jaws beneath him. So precipitate was his impetuous haste to vacate the dangerous limb. It was with a deep sigh of relief that I saw him gain a higher branch in safety. And then the brute did that which froze us both anew with horror. Grasping the tree stem with his powerful paws, he dragged down with all the great weight of his huge bulk and all the irresistible force of those mighty muscles. Slowly but surely the stem began to bend toward him. Inch by inch he worked his paws upward as the tree leaned more and more from the perpendicular. Perry clung, chattering in a panic of terror. Higher and higher into the bending and swaying tree he clambered. More and more rapidly was the tree-top inclining toward the ground. I saw now why the great brute was armed with such enormous paws. The use that he was putting them to was precisely that for which nature had intended them. The sloth-like creature was herbivorous, and to feed that mighty carcass, entire trees must be stripped of their foliage. The reason for its attacking us might easily be accounted for on the supposition of an ugly disposition such as that which the fierce and stupid rhinoceros of Africa possesses. But these were later reflections. At the moment I was too frantic with apprehension on Perry's behalf to consider aught other than a means to save him from the death that loomed so close. Realizing that I could outdistance the clumsy brute in the open, I dropped from my leafy sanctuary, intent only on distracting the thing's attention from Perry long enough to enable the old man to gain the safety of a larger tree. There were many close by which not even the terrific strength of that titanic monster could bend. As I touched the ground, I snatched a broken limb from the tangled mass that matted the jungle-like floor of the forest, and leaping unnoticed behind the shaggy back, dealt the brute a terrific blow. My plan worked like magic. From the previous slowness of the beast, I had been led to look for no such marvelous agility as he now displayed. Releasing his hold upon the tree, he dropped on all fours and at the same time swung his great wicked tail with a force that would have broken every bone in my body had it struck me. But fortunately, I had turned to flee at the very instant that I felt my blow land upon the towering back. As it started in pursuit of me, I made the mistake of running along the edge of the forest rather than making for the open beach. In a moment I was knee-deep in rotting vegetation, and the awful thing behind me was gaining rapidly as I floundered and fell in my efforts to extricate myself. A fallen log gave me an instant's advantage, for climbing upon it I leaped to another a few paces farther on, and in this way was able to keep clear of the mush that carpeted the surrounding ground. But the zigzag course that this necessitated was placing such a heavy handicap upon me that my pursuer was steadily gaining upon me. Suddenly from behind I heard a tumult of howls and sharp, piercing barks, much the sound that a pack of wolves raises when in full cry. Involuntarily I glanced backward to discover the origin of this new and menacing note, with the result that I missed my footing and went sprawling once more upon my face in the deep muck. My mammoth enemy was so close by this time that I knew I must feel the weight of one of his terrible paws before I could rise. But to my surprise, the blow did not fall upon me. The howling and snapping and barking of the new element which had been infused into the melee now seemed centered quite close behind me, and as I raised myself upon my hands and glanced around, I saw what it was that had distracted the direth, as I afterward learned the thing is called, from my trail. It was surrounded by a pack of some 100 wolf-like creatures, wild dogs they seemed, that rushed growling and snapping in upon it from all sides, so that they sank their white fangs into the slow brute and were away again before it could reach them with its huge paws or sweeping tail. But these were not all that my startled eyes perceived. Chattering and gibbering through the lower branches of the trees came a company of man-like creatures evidently urging on the dog-pack. They were to all appearances strikingly similar in aspect to the Negro of Africa. Their skins were very black, and their features much like those of the more pronounced Negroid type, except that the head receded more rapidly above the eyes, leaving little or no forehead. Their arms were rather longer, and their legs shorter in proportion to the torso than in man, and later I noticed that their great toes protruded at right angles from their feet, because of their arboreal habits, I presume. Behind them trailed long, slender tails, which they used in climbing quite as much as they did either their hands or feet. I had stumbled to my feet the moment that I discovered that the wolf dogs were holding the Durith at bay. At sight of me, several of the savage creatures left off, worrying the great brute to come slinking with bared fangs toward me. And as I turned to run toward the trees again to seek safety among the lower branches, I saw a number of the man-apes leaping and chattering in the foliage of the nearest tree. Between them and the beasts behind me there was little choice, but at least there was a doubt as to the reception these grotesque parodies on humanity would accord me, while there was none as to the fate which awaited me beneath the grinning fangs of my fierce pursuers. And so I raced on toward the trees, intending to pass beneath that which held the man-things and take refuge in another farther on. But the wolf-dogs were very close behind me, so close that I had despaired of escaping them, when one of the creatures in the tree above swung down head foremost, his tail looped about a great limb, and grasping me beneath my armpits, swung me in safety up among his fellows. There they fell to examining me with the utmost excitement and curiosity. They picked at my clothing, my hair, and my flesh. They turned me about to see if I had a tail, and when they discovered that I was not so equipped, they fell into roars of laughter. Their teeth were very large and white and even, except for the upper canines, which were a trifle longer than the others, protruding just a bit when the mouth was closed. When they had examined me for a few moments, one of them discovered that my clothing was not a part of me, with the result that garment by garment they tore it from me amidst peals of the wildest laughter. Ape-like, they essayed to don the apparel themselves, but their ingenuity was not sufficient to the task, and so they gave it up. In the meantime, I had been straining my eyes to catch a glimpse of Perry, but nowhere about could I see him, although the clump of trees in which he had first taken refuge was in full view. I was much exercised by fear that something had befallen him, and though I called his name aloud several times, there was no response. Tired at last of playing with my clothing, the creatures threw it to the ground, and catching me, one on either side, by an arm, started off at a most terrifying pace through the treetops. Never have I experienced such a journey before or since. Even now I oftentimes awake from a deep sleep haunted by the horrid remembrance of that awful experience. From tree to tree the agile creatures sprang like flying squirrels, while the cold sweat stood upon my brow as I glimpsed the depths beneath, into which a single misstep on the part of either of my bearers would hurl me. As they bore me along, my mind was occupied with 1,000 bewildering thoughts. What had become of Perry? Would I ever see him again? What were the intentions of these half-human things into whose hands I had fallen? Were they inhabitants of the same world into which I had been born? No, it could not be. But yet where else? I had not left that earth. Of that I was sure. Still neither could I reconcile the things which I had seen to a belief that I was still in the world of my birth. With a sigh, I gave it up. Chapter 3. A Change of Masters. We must have travelled several miles through the dark and dismal wood when we came suddenly upon a dense village built high among the branches of the trees. As we approached it, my escort broke into wild shouting, which was immediately answered from within, and a moment later a swarm of creatures of the same strange race as those who had captured me poured out to meet us. Again I was the centre of a wildly chattering horde. I was pulled this way and that, pinched, pounded, and thumped until I was black and blue, yet I do not think that their treatment was dictated by either cruelty or malice. I was a curiosity, a freak, a new plaything, and their childish minds required the added evidence of all their senses to back up the testimony of their eyes. Presently they dragged me within the village, which consisted of several hundred rude shelters of boughs and leaves supported upon the branches of the trees. Between the huts, which sometimes formed crooked streets, were dead branches and the trunks of small trees, which connected the huts upon one tree to those within adjoining trees. The whole network of huts and pathways forming an almost solid flooring a good 50 feet above the ground. I wondered why these agile creatures required connecting bridges between the trees, but later, when I saw the motley aggregation of half-savage beasts which they kept within their village, I realized the necessity for the pathways. There were a number of the same vicious wolf dogs which we had left worrying the deerith, and many goat-like animals whose distended udders explained the reasons for their presence. My guard halted before one of the huts into which I was pushed. Then 2 of the creatures squatted down before the entrance, to prevent my escape, doubtless. Though where I should have escaped to, I certainly had not the remotest conception. I had no more than entered the dark shadows of the interior than there fell upon my ears the tones of a familiar voice in prayer. "Perry!" I cried. "Dear old Perry, thank the Lord you are safe. David, can it be possible that you escaped?" And the old man stumbled toward me and threw his arms about me. He had seen me fall before the deerith, and then he had been seized by a number of the ape creatures and borne through the tree-tops to their village. His captors had been as inquisitive as to his strange clothing as had mine, with the same result. As we looked at each other, we could not help but laugh. "With a tail, David," remarked Perry, "you would make a very handsome ape." "Maybe we can borrow a couple," I rejoined. "They seem to be quite the thing this season. I wonder what the creatures intend doing with us, Perry. They don't seem really savage. What do you suppose they can be?" "You were about to tell me where we are when that great hairy frigate bore down upon us. Have you really any idea at all?" "Yes, David," he replied. "I know precisely where we are. We have made a magnificent discovery, my boy. We have proved that the earth is hollow. We have passed entirely through its crust to the inner world." "Perry, you are mad!" "Not at all. David, for 250 miles, our prospector bore us through the crust beneath our outer world. At that point, it reached the center of gravity of the 500-mile-thick crust. Up to that point, we had been descending. Direction is, of course, merely relative. Then, at the moment that our seats revolved, the thing that made you believe that we had turned about and were speeding upward, we passed the center of gravity, and though we did not alter the direction of our progress, yet we were in reality moving upward toward the surface of the inner world. Does not the strange fauna and flora which we have seen convince you that you are not in the world of your birth? And the horizon, could it present the strange aspects which we both noted unless we were indeed standing upon the inside surface of a sphere?" "But the sun, Perry," I urged. "How in the world can the sun shine through 500 miles of solid crust? It is not the sun of the outer world that we see here. It is another sun, an entirely different sun, that casts its eternal noonday effulgence upon the face of the inner world. Look at it now, David, if you can see it from the doorway of this hut, and you will see that it is still in the exact center of the heavens. We have been here for many hours, yet it is still noon, and withal it is very simple, David. The earth was once a nebulous mass. It cooled, and as it cooled, it shrank. At length a thin crust of solid matter formed upon its outer surface, a sort of shell, but within it was partially molten matter and highly expanded gases. As it continued to cool, what happened? Centrifugal force hurled the particles of the nebulous center toward the crust as rapidly as they approached a solid state. You have seen the same principle practically applied in the modern cream separator. Presently, there was only a small superheated core of gaseous matter remaining within a huge vacant interior left by the contraction of the cooling gases. The equal attraction of the solid crust from all directions maintained this luminous core in the exact center of the hollow globe. What remains of it is the sun you saw today, a relatively tiny thing at the exact center of the earth. Equally to every part of this inner world, it diffuses its perpetual noonday light and torrid heat. This inner world must have cooled sufficiently to support animal life long ages after life appeared upon the outer crust. but that the same agencies were at work here is evident from the similar forms of both animal and vegetable creation which we have already seen. Take the great beast which attacked us, for example, unquestionably a counterpart of the megatherium of the post-Pliocene period of the outer crust, whose fossilized skeleton has been found in South America. But the grotesque inhabitants of this forest, I urged, surely they have no counterpart in the earth's history. Who can tell, he rejoined. They may constitute the link between ape and man, all traces of which have been swallowed by the countless convulsions which have racked the outer crust, or they may merely the result of evolution along slightly different lines. Either is quite possible. Further speculation was interrupted by the appearance of several of our captors before the entrance of the hut. 2 of them entered and dragged us forth. The perilous pathways and the surrounding trees were filled with the black ape-men, their females and their young. There was not an ornament, a weapon, or a garment among the lot. "Quite low in the scale of creation," commented Perry. "Quite high enough to play the deuce with us, though," I replied. "Now what do you suppose they intend doing with us?" We were not long in learning. As on the occasion of our trip to the village, we were seized by a couple of the powerful creatures and whirled away through the tree-tops, while about us and in our wake raced a chattering, jabbering, grinning horde of sleek black ape-things. Twice my bearers missed their footing, and my heart ceased beating as we plunged toward instant death among the tangled deadwood beneath. But on both occasions those lithe, powerful tails reached out and found sustaining branches, nor did either of the creatures loosen their grasp upon me. In fact, it seemed that the incidents were of no greater moment to them than would be the stubbing of one's toe at a street crossing in the outer world. They but laughed uproariously and sped on with me. For some time they continued through the forest. How long I could not guess, for I was learning, what was later borne very forcefully to my mind, that time ceases to be a factor the moment means for measuring it ceased to exist. Our watches were gone, and we were living beneath a stationary sun. Already I was puzzled to compute the period of time which had elapsed since we broke through the crust of the inner world. It might be hours, or it might be days. Who in the world could tell where it was always noon? By the sun, no time had elapsed, but my judgment told me that we must have been several hours in this strange world. Presently the forest terminated, and we came out upon a level plain. A short distance before us rose a few low, rocky hills. Toward these our captors urged us, and after a short time led us through a narrow pass into a tiny circular valley. Here they got down to work, and we were soon convinced that if we were not to die to make a Roman holiday, we were to die for some other purpose. The attitude of our captors altered immediately as they entered the natural arena within the rocky hills. Their laughter ceased. Grim ferocity marked their bestial faces. Bared fangs menaced us. We were placed in the center of the amphitheater, the 1,000 creatures forming a great ring about us. Then a wolf-dog was brought, Hyenodon Perry called it, and turned loose with us inside the circle. The thing's body was as large as that of a full-grown mastiff. Its legs were short and powerful, and its jaws broad and strong. Dark, shaggy hair covered its back and sides, while its breast and belly were quite white. As it slunk toward us, it presented a most formidable aspect, with its upcurled lips baring its mighty fangs. Perry was on his knees, praying. I stooped and picked up a small stone. At my movement, the beast veered off a bit and commenced circling us. Evidently it had been a target for stones before. The ape-things were dancing up and down, urging the brute on with savage cries, until at last, seeing that I did not throw, he charged us. At Andover and later at Yale, I had pitched on winning ball teams. My speed and control must both have been above the ordinary, for I made such a record during my senior year at college that overtures were made to me in behalf of one of the Major League teams. But in the tightest pitch that ever had confronted me in the past, I had never been in such need for control as now. As I wound up for the delivery, I held my nerves and muscles under absolute command, though the grinning jaws were hurtling toward me at terrific speed, and then I let go, with every ounce of my weight and muscle and science in back of that throw. The stone caught the hyenodon full upon the end of the nose and sent him bowling over upon his back. At the same instant, a chorus of shrieks and howls arose from the circle of spectators, so that for a moment I thought that the upsetting of their champion was the cause. But in this I soon saw that I was mistaken. As I looked, the ape things broke in all directions toward the surrounding hills, and then I distinguished the real cause of their perturbation. Behind them, streaming through the pass which leads into the valley, came a swarm of hairy men, gorilla-like creatures armed with spears and hatchets and bearing long, oval shields. Like demons they set upon the ape things, and before them the hyenodon, which had now regained its senses and its feet, fled howling with fright. Past us swept the pursued and the pursuers, nor did the hairy ones accord us more than a passing glance until the arena had been emptied of its former occupants. Then they returned to us, and one who seemed to have authority among them directed that we be brought with them. When we had passed out of the amphitheatre onto the great plain, we saw a caravan of men and women, human beings like ourselves, and for the first time hope and relief filled my heart, until I could have cried out in the exuberance of my happiness. It is true that they were a half-naked, wild-appearing aggregation, but they at least were fashioned along the same lines as ourselves. There was nothing grotesque or horrible about them, as about the other creatures in this strange, weird world. But as we came closer, our hearts sank once more, for we discovered that the poor wretches were chained neck to neck in a long line, and that the gorilla men were their guards. With little ceremony, Perry and I were chained at the end of the line, and without further ado, the interrupted march was resumed. Up to this time, the excitement had kept us both up, but now the tiresome monotony of the long march across the sun-baked plain brought on all the agonies consequent to a long-denied sleep. On and on we stumbled beneath that hateful noonday sun. If we fell, we were prodded with a sharp point. Our companions in chains did not stumble. They strode along proudly erect. Occasionally they would exchange words with one another in a monosyllabic language. They were a noble-appearing race with well-formed heads and perfect physiques. The men were heavily bearded, tall and muscular, the women smaller and more gracefully moulded, with great masses of raven hair caught into loose knots upon their heads. The features of both sexes were well proportioned. There was not a face among them that would have been called even plain if judged by earthly standards. They wore no ornaments. But this, I later learned, was due to the fact that their captors had stripped them of everything of value. As garmenture, the women possessed a single robe of some light-coloured spotted hide, rather similar in appearance to a leopard's skin. This they wore either supported entirely about the waist by a leathern thong, so that it hung partially below the knee on one side, or possibly looped gracefully across one shoulder. Their feet were shod with skin sandals. The men wore loincloths of the hide of some shaggy beast, long ends of which depended before and behind nearly to the ground. In some instances these ends were finished with the strong talons of the beast from which the hides had been taken. Our guards, whom I already have described as gorilla-like men, were rather lighter in build than a gorilla, but even so they were indeed mighty creatures. Their arms and legs were proportioned more in conformity with human standards, but their entire bodies were covered with shaggy brown hair, and their faces were quite as brutal as those of the few stuffed specimens of the gorilla which I had seen in the museums at home. Their only redeeming feature lay in the development of the head above and back of the ears. In this respect they were not one whit less human than we. They were clothed in a sort of tunic of light cloth which reached to the knees. Beneath this they wore only a loin-cloth of the same material, while their feet were shod with thick hide of some mammoth creature of this inner world. Their arms and necks were encircled by many ornaments of metal, silver predominating, and on their tunics were sewn the heads of tiny reptiles in odd and rather artistic designs. They talked among themselves as they marched along on either side of us, but in a language which I perceived differed from that employed by our fellow prisoners. When they addressed the latter, they used what appeared to be a third language, and which I later learned is a mongrel tongue rather analogous to the pidgin English of the Chinese coolie. How far we marched, I have no conception, nor has Perry. Both of us were asleep much of the time for hours before a halt was called. Then we dropped in our tracks. I say for hours, but how may one measure time where time does not exist? When our march commenced, the sun stood at zenith. When we halted, our shadows still pointed toward nadir. Whether an instant or an eternity of earthly time elapsed, who may say? That march may have occupied 9 years and 11 months of the 10 years that I spent in the inner world. Or it may have been accomplished in the fraction of a second. I cannot tell. But this I do know, that since you have told me that 10 years have elapsed since I departed from this earth, I have lost all respect for time. I am commencing to doubt that such a thing exists other than in the weak, finite mind of man. Chapter 4. Dian the Beautiful. When our guards aroused us from sleep, we were much refreshed. They gave us food. Strips of dried meat it was, but it put new life and strength into us, so that now we too marched with high-held heads and took noble strides. At least I did, for I was young and proud, but poor Perry hated walking. On earth I'd often seen him call a cab to travel a square. He was paying for it now, and his old legs wobbled so that I put my arm about him and half carried him through the balance of those frightful marches. The country began to change at last, and we wound up out of the level plain through mighty mountains of virgin granite. The tropical verdure of the lowlands was replaced by hardier vegetation, but even here the effects of constant heat and light were apparent in the immensity of the trees and the profusion of foliage and blooms. Crystal streams roared through their rocky channels, fed by the perpetual snows which we could see far above us. Above the snow-capped heights hung masses of heavy clouds. It was these, Perry explained, which evidently served the double purpose of replenishing the melting snows and protecting them from the direct rays of the sun. By this time we had picked up a smattering of the bastard language in which our guards addressed us, as well as making good headway in the rather charming tongue of our co-captives. Directly ahead of me in the chain gang was a young woman. 3 feet of chain linked us together in a forced companionship which I, at least, soon rejoiced in. For I found her a willing teacher, and from her I learned the language of her tribe and much of the life and customs of the inner world, at least that part of it with which she was familiar. She told me that she was called Dian the Beautiful, and that she belonged to the tribe of Amos, which dwells in the cliffs above the Der El Az, or Shallow Sea. "How came you here?" I asked her. "I was running away from Jubal the Ugly One," she answered, as though that was explanation quite sufficient. "Who is Jubal the Ugly One?" I asked. "And why did you run away from him?" She looked at me in surprise. "Why does a woman run away from a man?" She answered my question with another. "They do not where I come from," I replied. "Sometimes they run after them." But she could not understand, nor could I get her to grasp the fact that I was of another world. She was quite as positive that creation was originated solely to produce her own kind and the world she lived in as are many of the outer world. "But Jubal," I insisted, "tell me about him, and why you ran away to be chained by the neck and scourged across the face of a world." "Jubal the Ugly One placed his trophy before my father's house. It was the head of a mighty Tandor. It remained there, and no greater trophy was placed beside it. So I knew that Jubal the Ugly One would come and take me as his none other so powerful wished me, or they would have slain a mightier beast, and thus have won me from Jubal. My father is not a mighty hunter. Once he was, but a Sadok tossed him, and never again had he the full use of his right arm. My brother, Dacor the Strong One, had gone to the land of Sari to steal a mate for himself. Thus there was none, father, brother, or lover, to save me from Jubal the Ugly One, and I ran away and hid among the hills that skirt the land of Amos, and there these Sagoths found me and made me captive." "What will they do with you?" I asked. "Where are they taking us?" Again she looked her incredulity. "I can almost believe that you are of another world," she said, "for otherwise such ignorance were inexplicable. Do you really mean that you do not know that the Sagoths are the creatures of the Mahars? The mighty Mahars who think they own Pellucidar, and all that walks or grows upon its surface, or creeps or burrows beneath, or swims within its lakes and oceans, or flies through its air? Next you will be telling me that you never before heard of the Mahars. I was loath to do it, and further incur her scorn, but there was no alternative if I were to absorb knowledge, so I made a clean breast of my pitiful ignorance as to the mighty Mahars. She was shocked, but she did her very best to enlighten me, though much that she said was as Greek would have been to her. She described the Mahars largely by comparisons. In this way they were like unto Thipdars, in that to the hairless Ledi. About all I gleaned of them was that they were quite hideous, had wings and webbed feet, lived in cities built beneath the ground, could swim under water for great distances, and were very, very wise. The Sagoths were their weapons of offence and defence, and the races like herself were their hands and feet. They were the slaves and servants who did all the manual labour. The Mahars were the heads, the brains of the inner world. I longed to see this wondrous race of supermen. Perry learned the language with me. When we halted, as we occasionally did, though sometimes the halts seemed ages apart, he would join in the conversation, as would Guk the hairy one, he who was chained just ahead of Dian the beautiful. Ahead of Guk was Hooja the sly one. He too entered the conversation occasionally. Most of his remarks were directed toward Dian the beautiful. It didn't take half an eye to see that he had developed a bad case, but the girl appeared totally oblivious to his thinly veiled advances. Did I say thinly veiled? There is a race of men in New Zealand or Australia, I have forgotten which, who indicate their preference for the lady of their affections by banging her over the head with a bludgeon. By comparison with this method, Hooja's love-making might be called thinly veiled. At first it caused me to blush violently, although I have seen several old years out at Rector's, and in other less fashionable places off Broadway, and in Vienna and Hamburg. But the girl! She was magnificent! It was easy to see that she considered herself as entirely above and apart from her present surroundings and company. She talked with me and with Perry and with the taciturn Guk because we were respectful, but she couldn't even see Hooja the sly one, much less hear him, and that made him furious. He tried to get one of the Sagoths to move the girl up ahead of him in the slave gang, but the fellow only poked him with his spear and told him that he had selected the girl for his own property, that he would buy her from the Mahars as soon as they reached Phutra. Phutra, it seemed, was the city of our destination. After passing over the first chain of mountains, we skirted a salt sea, upon whose bosom swam countless horrid things. Seal-like creatures there were, with long necks stretching 10 and more feet above their enormous bodies, and whose snake heads were split with gaping mouths bristling with countless fangs. There were huge tortoises, too, paddling about among these other reptiles, which Perry said were plesiosaurs of the lias. I didn't question his veracity. They might have been most anything. Dian told me they were tandorazes, or tandors of the sea, and that the other and more fearsome reptiles, which occasionally rose from the deep to do battle with them, were asderiths, or sea diriths. Perry called them ichthyosaurs. They resembled a whale with the head of an alligator. I had forgotten what little geology I had studied at school. About all that remained was an impression of horror that the illustrations of restored prehistoric monsters had made upon me, and a well-defined belief that any man with a pig's shank and a vivid imagination could restore most any sort of Paleolithic monster he saw fit, and take rank as a first-class paleontologist. But when I saw these sleek, shiny carcasses shimmering in the sunlight as they emerged from the ocean, shaking their giant heads, when I saw the waters roll from their sinuous bodies in miniature waterfalls as they glided hither and thither, now upon the surface, now half submerged, as I saw them meet, open-mouthed, hissing and snorting in their titanic, interminable warring, I realized how futile is man's poor, weak imagination by comparison with nature's incredible genius. And Perry? He was absolutely flabbergasted. He said so himself. "David," he remarked, after we had marched for a long time beside that awful sea. "David, I used to teach geology, and I thought that I believed what I taught, but now I see that I did not believe it. that it is impossible for man to believe such things as these unless he sees them with his own eyes. We take things for granted, perhaps, because we are told them over and over again and have no way of disproving them, like religions, for example. But we don't believe them, we only think we do. If you ever get back to the outer world, you will find that the geologists and paleontologists will be the first to set you down a liar, for they know that no such creatures as they restore ever existed. It is all right to imagine them as existing in an equally imaginary epoch. But now, poof! At the next halt, Hooja, the sly one, managed to find enough slack chain to permit him to worm himself back quite close to Diane. We were all standing, and as he edged near the girl, she turned her back upon him in such a truly earthly feminine manner that I could scarce repress a smile. But it was a short-lived smile, for on the instant the sly one's hand fell upon the girl's bare arm, jerking her roughly toward him. I was not then familiar with the customs or social ethics which prevailed within Pellucidar. But even so, I did not need the appealing look which the girl shot to me from her magnificent eyes to influence my subsequent act. What the sly one's intention was, I paused not to inquire, but instead, before he could lay hold of her with his other hand, I placed a right to the point of his jaw that felled him in his tracks. A roar of approval went up from those of the other prisoners and the Sagoths who had witnessed the brief drama, not, as I later learned, because I had championed the girl, but for the neat and, to them, astounding method by which I had bested Hooja. And the girl? At first she looked at me with wide, wondering eyes, and then she dropped her head, her face half averted, and a delicate flush suffused her cheek. For a moment she stood thus in silence, and then her head went high, and she turned her back upon me as she had upon Hooja. Some of the prisoners laughed, and I saw the face of Gak, the hairy one, go very black as he looked at me searchingly, and what I could see of Diane's cheek went suddenly from red to white. Immediately after we resumed the march, and though I realized that in some way I had offended Diane the Beautiful, I could not prevail upon her to talk with me that I might learn wherein I had erred. In fact, I might quite as well have been addressing a sphinx for all the attention I got. At last my own foolish pride stepped in and prevented my making any further attempts, and thus a companionship that without my realizing it had come to mean a great deal to me was cut off. Thereafter I confined my conversation to Perry. Hooja did not renew his advances toward the girl, nor did he again venture near me. Again the weary and apparently interminable marching became a perfect nightmare of horrors to me. The more firmly fixed became the realization that the girl's friendship had meant so much to me, the more I came to miss it, and the more impregnable the barrier of silly pride. But I was very young, and would not ask Gak for the explanation which I was sure he could give, and that might have made everything all right again. On the march, or during halts, Diane refused consistently to notice me. When her eyes wandered in my direction, she looked either over my head or directly through me. At last I became desperate and determined to swallow my self-esteem, and again beg her to tell me how I had offended, and how I might make reparation. I made up my mind that I should do this at the next halt. We were approaching another range of mountains at the time, and when we reached them, instead of winding across them through some high-flung pass, we entered a mighty natural tunnel. A series of labyrinthine grottos, dark as Erebus. The guards had no torches or light of any description. In fact, we had seen no artificial light or sign of fire since we had entered Pellucidar. In a land of perpetual noon, there is no need of light above ground, yet I marveled that they had no means of lighting their way through these dark subterranean passages. So we crept along at a snail's pace, with much stumbling and falling, the guards keeping up a sing-song chant ahead of us, interspersed with certain high notes which I found always indicated rough places and turns. Halts were now more frequent, but I did not wish to speak to Diane until I could see from the expression of her face how she was receiving my apologies. At last, a faint glow ahead forewarned us of the end of the tunnel, for which I, for one, was devoutly thankful. Then, at a sudden turn, we emerged into the full light of the noonday sun. But with it came a sudden realization of what meant to me a real catastrophe. Diane was gone, and with her a half-dozen other prisoners. The guards saw it too, and the ferocity of their rage was terrible to behold. Their awesome, bestial faces were contorted in the most diabolical expressions as they accused each other of responsibility for the loss. Finally they fell upon us, beating us with their spear shafts and hatchets. They had already killed 2 near the head of the line, and were like to have finished the balance of us when their leader finally put a stop to the brutal slaughter. Never in all my life had I witnessed a more horrible exhibition of bestial rage. I thanked God that Dian had not been one of those left to endure it. Of the 12 prisoners who had been chained ahead of me, each alternate one had been freed, commencing with Dian. Hooja was gone. Gak remained. What could it mean? How had it been accomplished? The commander of the guards was investigating. Soon he discovered that the rude locks which had held the neckbands in place had been deftly picked. "Hooja the sly one," murmured Gak, who was now next to me in line. "He has taken the girl that you would not have," he continued, glancing at me. "That I would not have?" I cried. "What do you mean?" He looked at me closely for a moment. "I have doubted your story that you are from another world," he said at last. "But yet upon no other grounds could your ignorance of the ways of Pellucidar be explained. Do you really mean that you do not know that you offended the beautiful one, and how?" "I do not know, Gak," I replied. "Then shall I tell you. When a man of Pellucidar intervenes between another man and the woman the other man would have, the woman belongs to the victor. Dian the Beautiful belongs to you. You should have claimed her or released her. Had you taken her hand, it would have indicated your desire to make her your mate, and had you raised her hand above her head and then dropped it, it would have meant that you did not wish her for a mate and that you released her from all obligation to you. By doing neither, you have put upon her the greatest affront that a man may put upon a woman. Now she is your slave. No man will take her as mate, or may take her honorably, until he shall have overcome you in combat, and men do not choose slave women as their mates, at least not the men of Pellucidar." "I did not know, Gak," I cried. "I did not know. Not for all Pellucidar would I have harmed Dian the Beautiful by word or look or act of mine. I do not want her as my slave. I do not want her as my—" But here I stopped. The vision of that sweet and innocent face floated before me amidst the soft mists of imagination, and where I had on the second believed that I clung only to the memory of a gentle friendship I had lost. Yet now it seemed that it would have been disloyalty to her to have said that I did not want Dian the Beautiful as my mate. I had not thought of her except as a welcome friend in a strange, cruel world. Even now I did not think that I loved her. I believe Gak must have read the truth more in my expression than in my words, for presently he laid his hand upon my shoulder. "Man of another world," he said, "I believe you. Lips may lie, but when the heart speaks through the eyes, it tells only the truth. Your heart has spoken to me. I know now that you meant no affront to Dian the Beautiful. She is not of my tribe, but her mother is my sister. She does not know it. Her mother was stolen by Dian's father, who came with many others of the tribe of Amos to battle with us for our women, the most beautiful women of Pellucidar. Then was her father king of Amos, and her mother was daughter of the king of Sari, to whose power I, his son, have succeeded. Dian is the daughter of kings, though her father is no longer king, since the Sadok tossed him and Jubal the Ugly One wrested his kingship from him. Because of her lineage, the wrong you did her was greatly magnified in the eyes of all who saw it. She will never forgive you." I asked Gak if there was not some way in which I could release the girl from the bondage and ignominy I had unwittingly placed upon her. "If ever you find her, yes," he answered. "Merely to raise her hand above her head and drop it in the presence of others is sufficient to release her. But how may you ever find her, you who are doomed to a life of slavery yourself in the buried city of Phutra?" "Is there no escape?" I asked. "Hooja the Sly One escaped and took the others with him," replied Gak. "But there are no more dark places on the way to Phutra, and once there it is not so easy. The Mahas are very wise. Even if one escaped from Phutra, there are the Thipdars. They would find you, and then—" the hairy one shuddered. "No, you will never escape the Mahas." It was a cheerful prospect. I asked Perry what he thought about it, but he only shrugged his shoulders and continued a long-winded prayer he had been at for some time. He was wont to say that the only redeeming feature of our captivity was the ample time it gave him for the improvisation of prayers. It was becoming an obsession with him. The Sagoths had begun to take notice of his habit of declaiming throughout entire marches. One of them asked him what he was saying, to whom he was talking. The question gave me an idea, so I answered quickly before Perry could say anything. "Do not interrupt him," I said. "He is a very holy man in the world from which we come. He is speaking to spirits which you cannot see. Do not interrupt him, will spring out of the air upon you and rend you limb from limb. Like that, and I jumped toward the great brute with a loud boo that sent him stumbling backward." I took a long chance, I realized, but if we could make any capital out of Perry's harmless mania, I wanted to make it while the making was prime. It worked splendidly. The Sagoths treated us both with marked respect during the balance of the journey, and then passed the word along to their masters, the Mahars. 2 marches after this episode, we came to the city of Phutra. The entrance to it was marked by 2 lofty towers of granite, which guarded a flight of steps leading to the buried city. Sagoths were on guard here, as well as at 100 or more other towers scattered about over a large plain. Chapter 5, Slave. As we descended the broad staircase which led to the main avenue of Phutra, I caught my first sight of the dominant race of the inner world. Involuntarily I shrank back as one of the creatures approached to inspect us. A more hideous thing it would be impossible to imagine. The all-powerful Mahars of Pellucidar are great reptiles, some 6 or 8 feet in length, with long narrow heads and great round eyes. Their beak-like mouths are lined with sharp, white fangs, and the backs of their huge lizard bodies are serrated into bony ridges from their necks to the end of their long tails. Their feet are equipped with 3 webbed toes, while from the 4 feet, membranous wings, which are attached to their bodies just in front of the hind legs, protrude at an angle of 45 degrees toward the rear, ending in sharp points several feet above their bodies. I glanced at Perry as the thing passed me to inspect him. The old man was gazing at the horrid creature with wide, astonished eyes. When it passed on, he turned to me. "A Ramphorhynchus of the Middle Oolitic, David," he said. "But gad, how enormous! The largest remains we ever have discovered have never indicated a size greater than that attained by an ordinary crow." As we continued on through the main avenue of Phutra, we saw many thousands of the creatures coming and going upon their daily duties. They paid but little attention to us. Phutra is laid out underground with a regularity that indicates remarkable engineering skill. It is hewn from solid limestone strata. The streets are broad and of a uniform height of 20 feet. At intervals, tubes pierce the roof of this underground city, and by means of lenses and reflectors transmit the sunlight, softened and diffused to dispel what would otherwise be Cimmerian darkness. In like manner, air is introduced. Perry and I were taken with Gak to a large public building, where one of the Sagoths who had formed our guard explained to a Maharan official the circumstances surrounding our capture. The method of communication between these 2 was remarkable in that no spoken words were exchanged. They employed a species of sign language. As I was to learn later, the Mars have no ears nor any spoken language. Among themselves they communicate by means of what Perry says must be a 6th sense which is cognizant of a 4th dimension. I never did quite grasp him, though he endeavored to explain it to me upon numerous occasions. I suggested telepathy, but he said no, that it was not telepathy, since they could only communicate when in each other's presence, nor could they talk with the Sagoths or the other inhabitants of Pellucidar by the same method they used to converse with one another. "What they do," said Perry, "is to project their thoughts into the 4th dimension, when they become appreciable to the 6th sense of their listener. Do I make myself quite clear?" "You do not, Perry," I replied. He shook his head in despair and returned to his work. They had set us to carrying a great accumulation of Maharan literature from one apartment to another, and there arranging it upon shelves. I suggested to Perry that we were in the public library of Phutra. But later, as he commenced to discover the key to their written language, he assured me that we were handling the ancient archives of the race. During this period, my thoughts were continually upon Dian the Beautiful. I was, of course, glad that she had escaped the Mahars and the fate that had been suggested by the Sagoth who had threatened to purchase her upon our arrival at Phutra. I often wondered if the little party of fugitives had been overtaken by the guards who had returned to search for them. Sometimes I was not so sure, but that I should have been more contented to know that Dian was here in Phutra than to think of her at the mercy of Hooja the Sly One. Gak, Perry, and I often talked together of possible escape, but the Saurian was so steeped in his lifelong belief that no one could escape from the Mahars except by a miracle, that he was not much aid to us. His attitude was of one who waits for the miracle to come to him. At my suggestion, Perry and I fashioned some swords of scraps of iron, which we discovered among some rubbish in the cells where we slept, for we were permitted almost unrestrained freedom of action within the limits of the building to which we had been assigned. So great were the number of slaves who waited upon the inhabitants of Phutra that none of us was apt to be overburdened with work, nor were our masters unkind to us. We hid our new weapons beneath the skins which formed our beds, and then Perry conceived the idea of making bows and arrows, weapons apparently unknown within Pellucidar. Next came shields, but these I found it easier to steal from the walls of the outer guard-room of the building. We had completed these arrangements for our protection after leaving Phutra when the Sagoths, who had been sent to recapture the escaped prisoners, returned with 4 of them, of whom Hooja was one. Dian and 2 others had eluded them. It so happened that Hooja was confined in the same building with us. He told Gak that he had not seen Dian or the others after releasing them within the dark grotto. What had become of them he had not the faintest conception. They might be wandering yet, lost within the labyrinthine tunnel, if not dead from starvation. I was now still further apprehensive as to the fate of Dian, and at this time, I imagine, came the first realization that my affection for the girl might be prompted by more than friendship. During my waking hours, she was constantly the subject of my thoughts, and when I slept, her dear face haunted my dreams. More than ever was I determined to escape the Mahars. "Perry," I confided to the old man, "if I have to search every inch of this diminutive world, I am going to find Dian the Beautiful and right the wrong I unintentionally did her." That was the excuse I made for Perry's benefit. "Diminutive world," he scoffed. "You don't know what you are talking about." "My boy," and then he showed me a map of Pellucidar which he had recently discovered among the manuscript he was arranging. "Look," he cried, pointing to it, "this is evidently water, and all this land. Do you notice the general configuration of the 2 areas? Where the oceans are upon the outer crust is land here. These relatively small areas of ocean follow the general lines of the continents of the outer world. We know that the crust of the globe is 500 miles in thickness. Then the inside diameter of Pellucidar must be 7,000 miles, and the superficial area 165,480,000 square miles. 3/4 of this is land. Think of it! A land area of 124,110,000 square miles. Our own world contains but 53,000 square miles of land, the balance of its surface being covered by water. Just as we often compare nations by their relative land areas, so if we compare these 2 worlds in the same way, we have the strange anomaly of a larger world within a smaller one. Where within vast Pellucidar would you search for your Dian? Without stars or moon or changing sun, how could you find her, even though you knew where she might be found? The proposition was a corker. It quite took my breath away, but I found that it left me all the more determined to attempt it. "If Gak will accompany us, we may be able to do it," I suggested. Perry and I sought him out and put the question straight to him. "Gak," I said, "we are determined to escape from this bondage. Will you accompany us?" "They will set the Thipdars upon us," he said, "and then we shall be killed. But," he hesitated, "bah! I would take the chance if I thought that I might possibly escape and return to my own people." "Could you find your way back to your own land?" asked Perry. "And could you aid David in his search for Dian?" "Yes." "But how," persisted Perry, "could you travel to strange country without heavenly bodies or a compass to guide you?" Gak didn't know what Perry meant by heavenly bodies or a compass, but he assured us that you might blindfold any man of Pellucidar and carry him to the farthermost corner of the world, yet he would be able to come directly to his own home again by the shortest route. He seemed surprised to think that we found anything wonderful in it. Perry said it must be some sort of homing instinct, such as is possessed by certain breeds of earthly pigeons. I didn't know, of course, but it gave me an idea. "Then Diane could have found her way directly to her own people?" I asked. "Surely," replied Gak, "unless some mighty beast of prey killed her." I was for making the attempted escape at once, but both Perry and Gak counselled waiting for some propitious accident which would ensure us some small degree of success. I didn't see what accident could befall a whole community in a land of perpetual daylight where the inhabitants had no fixed habits of sleep. Why, I am sure that some of the Mahars never sleep, while others may, at long intervals, crawl into the dark recesses beneath their dwellings and curl up in protracted slumber. Perry says that if a Mahar stays awake for 3 years, he will make up all his lost sleep in a long year's snooze. That may be all true, but I never saw but 3 of them asleep, and it was the sight of these 3 that gave me a suggestion for our means of escape. I had been searching about far below the levels that we slaves were supposed to frequent, possibly 50 feet beneath the main floor of the building, among a network of corridors and apartments, when I came suddenly upon 3 Mahars curled up upon a bed of skins. At first I thought they were dead, but later their regular breathing convinced me of my error. Like a flash, the thought came to me of the marvelous opportunity these sleeping reptiles offered as a means of eluding the watchfulness of our captors and the Sagoth guards. Hastening back to Perry, where he pored over a musty pile of, to me, meaningless hieroglyphics, I explained my plan to him. To my surprise, he was horrified. "It would be murder, David," he cried. "Murder to kill a reptilian monster?" I asked in astonishment. "Here they are not monsters, David," he replied. "Here they are, the dominant race. We are the monsters, the lower orders. In Pellucidar, evolution has progressed along different lines than upon the outer earth. These terrible convulsions of nature time and time again wiped out the existing species. But for this fact, some monster of the Saurozoic epoch might rule today upon our own world. We see here what might well have occurred in our own history had conditions been what they have been here. Life within Pellucidar is far younger than upon the outer crust. Here man has but reached a stage analogous to the Stone Age of our own world's history, but for countless millions of years these reptiles have been progressing. Possibly it is the 6th sense, which I am sure they possess, that has given them an advantage over the other, and more frightfully armed of their fellows. But this we may never know. They look upon us as we look upon the beasts of our fields. And I learn from their written records that other races of Mahars feed upon men. They keep them in great droves, as we keep cattle. They breed them most carefully, and when they are quite fat, they kill and eat them. I shuddered. "What is there horrible about it, David?" the old man asked. "They understand us no better than we understand the lower animals of our own world. Why, I have come across here very learned discussions of the question as to whether Gelax, that is men, have any means of communication. One writer claims that we do not even reason, that our every act is mechanical or instinctive. The dominant race of Pellucidar, David, have not yet learned that men converse among themselves or reason. Because we do not converse as they do, it is beyond them to imagine that we converse at all. It is thus that we reason in relation to the brutes of our own world. They know that the Sagoths have a spoken language, but they cannot comprehend it, or how it manifests itself, since they have no auditory apparatus. They believe that the motions of the lips alone convey the meaning. That the Sagoths can communicate with us is incomprehensible to them. Yes, David, he concluded, it would entail murder to carry out your plan. Very well then, Perry, I replied. I shall become a murderer. He got me to go over the plan again most carefully, and for some reason which was not at the time clear to me, insisted upon a very careful description of the apartments and corridors I had just explored. "I wonder, David," he said at length, "as you are determined to carry out your wild scheme, if we could not accomplish something of very real and lasting benefit for the human race of Pellucidar at the same time. Listen, I have learned much of a most surprising nature from these archives of the Mahars. That you may appreciate my plan, I shall briefly outline the history of the race. Once the males were all-powerful, but ages ago the females, little by little, assumed the mastery. For other ages, no noticeable change took place in the race of Mahars. It continued to progress under the intelligent and beneficent rule of the ladies. Science took vast strides. This was especially true of the sciences, which we know as biology and eugenics. Finally, a certain female scientist announced the fact that she had discovered a method whereby eggs might be fertilized by chemical means after they were laid. All true reptiles, are hatched from eggs. What happened? Immediately, the necessity for males ceased to exist. The race was no longer dependent upon them. More ages elapsed until, at the present time, we find a race consisting exclusively of females. But here is the point. The secret of this chemical formula is kept by a single race of Mahars. It is in the city of Phutra, and unless I am greatly in error, I judge from your description of the vaults through which you passed today that it lies hidden in the cellar of this building. For 2 reasons they hide it away and guard it jealously. First, because upon it depends the very life of the race of Mahars, and second, owing to the fact that when it was public property, as at first so many were experimenting with it, that the danger of overpopulation became very grave. David, if we can escape and at the same time take with us this great secret, what will we not have accomplished for the human race within Pellucidar? The very thought of it fairly overpowered me. Why, we too would be the means of placing the men of the inner world in their rightful place among created things. Only the Sagoths would then stand between them and absolute supremacy. And I was not quite sure but that the Sagoths owed all their power to the greater intelligence of the Mahars. I could not believe that these gorilla-like beasts were the mental superiors of the human race of Pellucidar. "Why, Perry," I exclaimed, "you and I may reclaim a whole world. Together we can lead the races of men out of the darkness of ignorance into the light of advancement and civilization. At one step we may carry them from the age of stone to the 20th century. It's marvelous, absolutely marvelous, just to think about it." "David," said the old man, "I believe that God sent us here for just that purpose. It shall be my life work to teach them his word, to lead them into the light of his mercy, while we are training their hearts and hands in the ways of culture and civilization." "You are right, Perry," I said, "and while you are teaching them to pray, I'll be teaching them to fight, and between us we'll make a race of men that will be an honor to us both." Gakak had entered the apartment some time before we conclude our conversation, and now he wanted to know what we were so excited about. Perry thought we had best not tell him too much, and so I only explained that I had a plan for escape. When I had outlined it to him, he seemed about as horror-struck as Perry had been, but for a different reason. The hairy one only considered the horrible fate that would be ours were we discovered, but at last I prevailed upon him to accept my plan as the only feasible one, and when I had assured him that I would take all the responsibility for it, were we captured, he accorded a reluctant assent. Chapter 6. The Beginning of Horror. Within Pellucidar one time is as good as another. There were no nights to mask our attempted escape. All must be done in broad daylight, all but the work I had to do in the apartment beneath the building. So we determined to put our plan to an immediate test, lest the Mahars who made it possible should awake before I reached them. But we were doomed to disappointment. For no sooner had we reached the main floor of the building on our way to the pits beneath than we encountered hurrying bands of slaves being hastened under strong Sagoth guard out of the edifice to the avenue beyond. Other Sagoths were darting hither and thither in search of other slaves, and the moment that we appeared we were pounced upon and hustled into the line of marching humans. What the purpose or nature of the general exodus we did not know, but presently through the line of captives ran the rumor that 2 escaped slaves had been recaptured, a man and a woman, and that we were marching to witness their punishment, for the man had killed a Sagoth of the detachment that had pursued and overtaken them. At the intelligence my heart sprang to my throat, for I was sure that the two were of those who escaped in the dark grotto with Hooja the Sly One, and that Diane must be the woman. Guck thought so too, as did Perry. "Is there naught that we may do to save her?" I asked Guck. "Naught," he replied. Along the crowded avenue we marched, the guards showing unusual cruelty toward us, as though we, too, had been implicated in the murder of their fellow. The occasion was to serve as an object lesson to all other slaves of the danger and futility of attempted escape, and the fatal consequences of taking the life of a superior being, and so I imagine that Sagoths felt amply justified in making the entire proceeding as uncomfortable and painful to us possible. They jabbed us with their spears and struck at us with the hatchets at the least provocation, and at no provocation at all. It was a most uncomfortable half-hour that we spent before we were finally herded through a low entrance into a huge building, the center of which was given up to a good-sized arena. Benches surrounded this open space upon 3 sides, and along the 4th were heaped huge boulders, which rose in receding tiers toward the roof. At first I couldn't make out the purpose of this mighty pile of rock, unless it were intended as a rough and picturesque background for the scenes which were enacted in the arena before it. But presently, after the wooden benches had been pretty well filled by slaves and Sagoths, I discovered the purpose of the boulders, for then the Mahars began to file into the enclosure. They marched directly across the arena toward the rocks upon the opposite side, where, spreading their bat-like wings, they rose above the high wall of the pit, settling down upon the boulders above. These were the reserved seats, the boxes of the elect. Reptiles that they are, the rough surface of a great stone is to them as plush as upholstery to us. Here they lolled, blinking their hideous eyes, and doubtless conversing with one another in their sixth sense fourth-dimension language. For the first time I beheld their queen. She differed from the others in no feature that was appreciable to my earthly eyes. In fact, all Mahars look alike to me. But when she crossed the arena after the balance of her female subjects had found their boulders, she was preceded by a score of huge Sagoths, the largest I ever had seen, and on either side of her waddled a huge Thipdar, while behind came another score of Sagoth guardsmen. At the barrier, the Sagoths clambered up the steep side with truly ape-like agility, while behind them the haughty queen rose upon her wings with her 2 frightful dragons close beside her, and settled down upon the largest boulder of them all in the exact center of that side of the amphitheater which is reserved for the dominant race. Here she squatted, a most repulsive and uninteresting queen, though doubtless quite as well assured of her beauty and divine right to rule as the proudest monarch of the outer world. And then the music started. Music without sound! The Mahars cannot hear, so the drums and fifes and horns of earthly bands are unknown among them. The band consists of a score or more Mahars. It filed out in the center of the arena where the creatures upon the rocks might see it, and there it performed for 15 or 20 minutes. Their technique consisted in waving their tails and moving their heads in a regular succession of measured movements, resulting in a cadence which evidently pleased the eye of the Mahar as the cadence of our own instrumental music pleases our ears. Sometimes the band took measured steps in unison to one side or the other, or backward and again forward. It all seemed very silly and meaningless to me. But at the end of the first piece, the Mahars upon the rocks showed the first indications of enthusiasm that I had seen displayed by the dominant race of Pellucidar. They beat their great wings up and down, and smote their rocky perches with their mighty tails until the ground shook. Then the band started another piece, and all was again as silent as the grave. That was one great beauty about Mahar music. If you didn't happen to like a piece that was being played, all you had to do was shut your eyes. When the band had exhausted its repertory, it took wing and settled upon the rocks above and behind the queen. Then the business of the day was on. A man and woman were pushed into the arena by a couple of Sagoth guardsmen. I leaned forward in my seat to scrutinize the female, hoping against hope that she might prove to be another than Diane the Beautiful. Her back was toward me for a while, and the sight of the great mass of raven hair piled high upon her head filled me with alarm. Presently, a door in one side of the arena wall was opened to admit a huge, shaggy, bull-like creature. "A boz," whispered Perry excitedly. "His kind roamed the outer crust with the cave bear and the mammoth ages and ages ago. We have been carried back 1,000,000 years, David, to the childhood of a planet. Is it not wondrous?" But I saw only the raven hair of a half-naked girl, and my heart stood still in dumb misery at the sight of her, nor had I any eyes for the wonders of natural history. But for Perry and Gack, I should have leaped to the floor of the arena and shared whatever fate lay in store for this priceless treasure of the Stone Age. With the advent of the boz, they call the thing a thag within Pellucidar, 2 spears were tossed into the arena at the feet of the prisoners. It seemed to me that a bean shooter would have been as effective against the mighty monster as these pitiful weapons. As the animal approached the two, bellowing and pawing the ground with the strength of many earthly bulls, another door directly beneath us was open, and from it issued the most terrific roar that ever had fallen upon my outraged ears. I could not at first see the beast from which emanated this fearsome challenge, but the sound had the effect of bringing the 2 victims around with a sudden start, and then I saw the girl's face. She was not dying. I could have wept for relief. And now, as the 2 stood frozen in terror, I saw the author of that fearsome sound creeping stealthily into view. It was a huge tiger, such as hunted the great boz through the jungles primeval when the world was young. In contour and markings, it was not unlike the noblest of the Bengals of our own world, but as its dimensions were exaggerated to colossal proportions, so too were its colorings exaggerated. Its vivid yellows fairly screamed aloud. Its whites were as eider down, its blacks glossy as the finest anthracite coal, and its coat long and shaggy as a mountain goat. That it is a beautiful animal there is no gainsaying, but if its size and colours are magnified here within Pellucidar, so is the ferocity of its disposition. It is not the occasional member of its species that is a man-hunter. All are man-hunters, but they do not confine their foraging to man alone, for there is no flesh or fish within Pellucidar that they will not eat with relish in the constant efforts which they make to furnish their huge carcasses with sufficient sustenance to maintain their mighty thews. Upon one side of the doomed pair the thag bellowed and advanced, and upon the other Tarag the frightful crept toward them with gaping mouth and dripping fangs. The man seized the spears, handing one of them to the woman. At the sound of the roaring of the tiger, the bull's bellowing became a veritable frenzy of rageful noise. Never in my life had I heard such an infernal din as the 2 brutes made, and to think it was all lost upon the hideous reptiles for whom the show was staged. The thag was charging now from one side, and the tarag from the other. The 2 puny things standing between them seemed already lost, but at the very moment that the beasts were upon them, the man grasped his companion by the arm, and together they leaped to one side, while the frenzied creatures came together like locomotives in collision. There ensued a battle royal which for sustained and frightful ferocity transcends the power of imagination or description. Time and again the colossal bull tossed the enormous tiger high into the air, but each time that the huge cat touched the ground he returned to the encounter with apparently undiminished strength and seemingly increased ire. For a while, the man and woman busied themselves only with keeping out of the way of the 2 creatures, but finally I saw them separate and each creep stealthily toward one of the combatants. The tiger was now upon the bull's broad back, clinging to the huge neck with powerful fangs, while its long, strong talons ripped the heavy hide into shreds and ribbons. For a moment the bull stood bellowing and quivering with pain and rage, its cloven hoofs widespread, its tail lashing viciously from side to side, and then, in a mad orgy of bucking, it went careening about the arena in frenzied attempt to unseat its rending rider. It was with difficulty that the girl avoided the first mad rush of the wounded animal. All its efforts to rid itself of the tiger seemed futile, until in desperation it threw itself upon the ground, rolling over and over. A little of this so disconcerted the tiger, knocking its breath from it, I imagine, that it lost its hold, and then, quick as a cat, the great thag was up again and had buried those mighty horns deep in the tarag's abdomen, pinning him to the floor of the arena. The great cat clawed at the shaggy head until eyes and ears were gone, and naught but a few strips of ragged, bloody flesh remained upon the skull. Yet through all the agony of that fearful punishment, the thag still stood motionless, pinning down his adversary. And then the man leaped in, seeing that the blind bull would be the least formidable enemy, and ran his spear through the tarag's heart. As the animal's fierce clawing ceased, the bull raised his gory, sightless head, and with a horrid roar ran headlong across the arena. With great leaps and bounds he came, straight toward the arena wall directly beneath where we sat, and then accident carried him, in one of his mighty springs, completely over the barrier into the midst of the slaves and Sagoths just in front of us. Swinging his bloody horns from side to side, the beast cut a wide swath before him, straight upward toward our seats. Before him, slaves and guerrilla men fought in mad stampede to escape the menace of the creature's death agonies, for such only could that frightful charge have been. Forgetful of us, our guards joined in the general rush for the exits, many of which pierced the wall of the amphitheatre behind us. Perry, Gak, and I became separated in the chaos which reigned for a few moments after the beast cleared the wall of the arena, each intent upon saving his own hide. I ran to the right, passing several exits choked with the fear-mad mob that were battling to escape. One would have thought that an entire herd of thags was loose behind them, rather than a single blinded, dying beast. But such is the effect of panic upon a crowd. Chapter 7. Freedom. Once out of the direct path of the animal, fear of it left me. But another emotion as quickly gripped me, hope of escape, that the demoralized condition of the guards made possible for the instant. I thought of Perry, and but for the hope that I might better encompass his release if myself free, I should have put the thought of freedom from me at once. As it was, I hastened on toward the right, searching for an exit toward which no Sagoths were fleeing, and at last I found it, a low, narrow aperture leading into a dark corridor. Without thought of the possible consequence, I darted into the shadows of the tunnel, feeling my way along through the gloom for some distance. The noises of the amphitheatre had grown fainter and fainter until now all was as silent as the tomb about me. Faint light filtered from above through occasional ventilating and lighting tubes, but it was scarce sufficient to enable my human eyes to cope with the darkness, and so I was forced to move with extreme care, feeling my way along step by step with a hand upon the wall beside me. Presently the light increased, and a moment later, to my delight, I came upon a flight of steps leading upward, at the top of which the brilliant light of the noonday sun shone through an opening in the ground. Cautiously I crept up the stairway to the tunnel's end, and peering out saw the broad plain of Phutra before me. The numerous lofty granite towers which mark the several entrances to the subterranean city were all in front of me. Behind, the plain stretched level and unbroken to the nearby foothills. I had come to the surface, then, beyond the city, and my chances for escape seemed much enhanced. My first impulse was to await darkness before attempting to cross the plain, so deeply implanted are habits of thought. But of a sudden I recollected perpetual noonday brilliance which envelops Pellucidar, and with a smile I stepped forth into the daylight. Rank grass, waist-high, grows upon the plain of Phutra, the gorgeous flowering grass of the inner world, each particular blade of which is tipped with a tiny, five-pointed blossom, brilliant little stars of varying colors that twinkle in the green foliage to add still another charm to the weird yet lovely landscape. But then the only aspect which attracted me was the distant hills in which I hoped to find sanctuary, and so I hastened on, trampling the myriad beauties beneath my hurrying feet. Perry says that the force of gravity is less upon the surface of the inner world than upon that of the outer. He explained it all to me once, but I was never particularly brilliant in such matters, and so most of it has escaped me. As I recall it, the difference is due in some part to the counter-attraction of that portion of the Earth's crust directly opposite the spot upon the face of Pellucidar at which one's calculations are being made. Be that as it may, it always seemed to me that I moved with greater speed and agility within Pellucidar than upon the outer surface. There was a certain airy lightness of step that was most pleasing, and a feeling of bodily detachment which I can only compare with that occasionally experienced in dreams. And as I crossed Phutra's flower-bespangled plain, that time I seemed almost to fly, though how much of the sensation was due to Perry's suggestion and how much to actuality, I am sure I do not know. The more I thought of Perry, the less pleasure I took in my new-found freedom. There could be no liberty for me within Pellucidar unless the old man shared it with me, and only the hope that I might find some way to encompass his release kept me from turning back to Phutra. Just how I was to help Perry I could scarce imagine, but I hoped that some fortuitous circumstance might solve the problem for me. It was quite evident, however, that little less than a miracle could aid me, for what could I accomplish in this strange world, naked and unarmed? It was even doubtful that I could retrace my steps to Phutra should I once pass beyond view of the plain, and even were that possible, what aid could I bring to Perry, no matter how far I wandered? The case looked more and more hopeless the longer I viewed it, yet with a stubborn persistency I forged ahead toward the foothills. Behind me no sign of pursuit developed. Before me I saw no living thing. It was as though I moved through a dead and forgotten world. I have no idea, of course, how long it took me to reach the limit of the plain, but at last I entered the foothills, following a pretty little canyon upward toward the mountains. Beside me frolicked a laughing brooklet, hurrying upon its noisy way down to the silent sea. In its quieter pools I discovered many small fish, of 4 or 5 pound weight, I should imagine. In appearance, except as to size and colour, they were not unlike the whale of our own seas. As I watched them playing about, I discovered not only that they suckled their young, but that at intervals they rose to the surface to breathe as well as to feed upon certain grasses and a strange scarlet lichen which grew upon the rocks just above the waterline. It was this last habit that gave me the opportunity I craved to capture one of these herbivorous cetaceans, that is what Perry calls them, and make as good a meal as one can on raw, warm-blooded fish. But I had become rather used by this time to the eating of food in its natural state, though I still balked on the eyes and entrails, much to the amusement of Gak, to whom I always passed these delicacies. Crouching beside the brook, I waited until one of the diminutive purple whales rose to nibble at the long grasses which overhung the water, and then, like the beast of prey that man really is, I sprang upon my victim, appeasing my hunger while he yet wriggled to escape. Then I drank from the clear pool, and after washing my hands and face, continued my flight. Above the source of the brook I encountered a rugged climb to the summit of a long ridge. Beyond was a steep declivity to the shore of a placid inland sea, upon the quiet surface of which lay several beautiful islands. The view was charming in the extreme, and as no man or beast was to be seen that might threaten my new-found liberty, I slid over the edge of the bluff, and half-sliding, half-falling, dropped into the delightful valley, the very aspect of which seemed to offer a haven of peace and security. The gently sloping beach along which I walked was thickly strewn with strangely shaped coloured shells, some empty, others still housing as varied a multitude of mollusks as ever might have drawn out their sluggish lives along the silent shores of the antediluvian seas of the outer crust. As I walked, I could not but compare myself with the first man of that other world, so complete the solitude which surrounded me, so primal and untouched the virgin wonders and beauties of adolescent nature. I felt myself a second Adam wending my lonely way through the childhood of a world, searching for my Eve, and at the thought there rose before my mind's eye the exquisite outlines of a perfect face surmounted by a loose pile of wondrous raven hair. As I walked, my eyes were bent upon the beach, so that it was not until I had come quite upon it that I discovered that which shattered all my beautiful dream of solitude and safety and peace and primal overlordship. The thing was a hollowed log drawn upon the sands, and in the bottom of it lay a crude paddle. The rude shock of awakening to what doubtless might prove some new form of danger was still upon me when I heard a rattling of loose stones from the direction of the bluff, and turning my eyes in that direction, I beheld the author of the disturbance, a great copper-coloured man, running rapidly toward me. There was that in the haste with which he came which seemed quite sufficiently menacing, so that I did not need the added evidence of brandishing spear and scowling face to warn me that I was in no safe position. But whither to flee was indeed a momentous question. The speed of the fellow seemed to preclude the possibility of escaping him upon the open beach. There was but a single alternative, the rude skiff, and with a celerity which equalled his, I pushed the thing into the sea, and as it floated, gave a final shove and clambered in over the end. A cry of rage rose from the owner of the primitive craft, and an instant later his heavy, stone-tipped spear grazed my shoulder and buried itself in the bow of the boat beyond. Then I grasped the paddle, and with feverish haste urged the awkward, wobbly thing out upon the surface of the sea. A glance over my shoulder showed me that the copper-coloured one had plunged in after me and was swimming rapidly in pursuit. His mighty strokes bade fair to close up the distance between us in short order, for at best I could make but slow progress with my unfamiliar craft, which nosed stubbornly in every direction but that which I desired to follow, so that fully half my energy was expended in turning its blunt prow back into the course. I had covered some 100 yards from shore when it became evident that my pursuer must grasp the stern of the skiff within the next half-dozen strokes. In a frenzy of despair, I bent to the grandfather of all paddles in a hopeless effort to escape, and still the copper giant behind me gained and gained. His hand was reaching upward for the stern when I saw a sleek, sinuous body shoot from the depths below. The man saw it too, and the look of terror that overspread his face assured me that I need have no further concern as to him, for the fear of certain death was in his look. And then about him coiled the great, slimy folds of a hideous monster of that prehistoric deep, a mighty serpent of the sea, with fanged jaws and darting forked tongue, with bulging eyes and bony protuberances upon head and snout that formed short, stout horns. As I looked at that hopeless struggle, my eyes met those of the doomed man, and I could have sworn that in his I saw an expression of hopeless appeal. But whether I did or not, there swept through me a sudden compassion for the fellow. He was indeed a brother man, and that he might have killed me with pleasure had he caught me was forgotten in the extremity of his danger. Unconsciously I had ceased paddling as the serpent rose to engage my pursuer, so now the skiff still drifted close beside the two. The monster seemed to be but playing with his victim before he closed his awful jaws upon him and dragged him down to his dark den beneath the surface to devour him. The huge, snake-like body coiled and uncoiled about its prey. The hideous, gaping jaws snapped in the victim's face. The forked tongue, lightning-like, ran in and out upon the copper skin. Nobly the giant battled for his life, beating with his stone hatchet against the bony armor that covered that frightful carcass, but for all the damage he inflicted, he might as well have struck with his open palm. At last I could endure no longer to sit supinely by while a fellowman was dragged down to a horrible death by that repulsive reptile. Embedded in the prow of the skiff lay the spear that had been cast after me by him whom I suddenly to save. With a wrench I tore it loose, and standing upright in the wobbly log, with all the strength of my two arms, straight into the gaping jaws of the hydrophidian. With a loud hiss the creature abandoned its prey to turn upon me, but the spear embedded in its throat prevented it from seizing me, though it came near to overturning the skiff in its mad efforts to reach me. Chapter 8. The Maha Temple. The aborigine, apparently uninjured, climbed quickly into the skiff, and seizing the spear with me, helped to hold off the infuriated creature. Blood from the wounded reptile was now crimsoning the waters about us, and soon from the weakening struggles it became evident that I had inflicted a death wound upon it. Presently its efforts to reach us ceased entirely, and with a few convulsive movements it turned upon its back quite dead. And then there came to me a sudden realization of the predicament in which I had placed myself. I was entirely within the power of the savage man whose skiff I had stolen. Still clinging to the spear, I looked into his face to find him scrutinizing me intently, and there we stood for some several minutes, each clinging tenaciously to the weapon, the while we gazed in stupid wonderment at each other. What was in his mind I do not know, but in my own was merely the question as to how soon the fellow would recommence hostilities. Presently he spoke to me, but in a tongue which I was unable to translate. I shook my head in an effort to indicate my ignorance of his language, at the same time addressing him in the bastard tongue that the Sagoths use to converse with the human slaves of the Mahars. To my delight, he understood and answered me in the same jargon. "What do you want of my spear?" he asked. "Only to keep you from running it through me," I replied. "I would not do that," he said, "for you have just saved my life." And with that he released his hold upon it and squatted down in the bottom of the skiff. "Who are you?" he continued, "and from what country do you come?" I, too, sat down, laying the spear between us, and tried to explain how I came to Pellucidar, and where from, but it was as impossible for him to grasp or believe the strange tale I told him, as I fear it is for you upon the outer crust to believe in the existence of the inner world. To him it seemed quite ridiculous to imagine that there was another world far beneath his feet, peopled by beings similar to himself, and he laughed uproariously the more he thought upon it. But it was ever thus. That which has never come within the scope of our really pitifully meagre world experience cannot be. Our finite minds cannot grasp that which may not exist in accordance with the conditions which obtain about us upon the outside of the insignificant grain of dust which wends its tiny way among the boulders of the universe, the speck of moist dirt we so proudly call the world. So I gave it up and asked him about himself. He said he was a Mesop, and that his name was Jar. "Who are the Mesops?" I asked. "Where do they live?" He looked at me in surprise. "I might indeed believe that you were from another world," he said, "for who of Pellucidar could be so ignorant? The Mesops live upon the islands of the seas. In so far as I ever have heard, no Mesop lives elsewhere, and no others than Mesops dwell upon islands, but of course may be different in other far distant lands. I do not know. At any rate, in this sea and those nearby, it is true that only people of my race inhabit the islands. We are fishermen, though we be great hunters as well, often going to the mainland in search of the game that is scarce upon all but the larger islands. And we are warriors also," he added proudly. "Even the Sagoths of the Mahars fear us. Once, when Pellucidar was young, the Sagoths were wont to capture us for slaves, as they do the other men of Pellucidar. It is handed down father to son among us that this is so. But we fought so desperately and slew so many Sagoths, and those of us that were captured killed so many Mahars in their own cities, that at last they learned that it were better to leave us alone. And later came the time that the Mahars became too indolent even to catch their own fish, except for amusement. And then they needed us to supply their wants, and so a truce was made between the races. Now they give us certain things which we are unable to produce in return for the fish that we catch, and the Mesops and the Mahars live in peace. The great ones even come to our islands. It is there, far from the prying eyes of their own Sagoths, that they practice their religious rites in the temples they have builded there with our assistance. If you live among us, you will doubtless see the manner of their worship, which is strange indeed, and most unpleasant for the poor slaves they bring to take part in it." As Jar talked, I had an excellent opportunity to inspect him more closely. He was a huge fellow, standing, I should say, 6 feet 6 or 7 inches, well developed, and of a coppery red not unlike that of our own North American Indian, nor were his features dissimilar to theirs. He had the aquiline nose found among many of the higher tribes, the prominent cheekbones and black hair and eyes, but his mouth and lips were better moulded. All in all, Jar was an impressive and handsome creature, and he talked well too, even in the miserable makeshift language we were compelled to use. During our conversation, Jar had taken the paddle and was propelling the skiff with vigorous strokes toward a large island that lay some half-mile from the mainland. The skill with which he handled his crude and awkward craft elicited my deepest admiration, since it had been so short a time before that I had made such pitiful work of it. As we touched the pretty level beach, Jar leaped out, and I followed him. Together we dragged the skiff far up into the bushes that grew beyond the sand. "We must hide our canoes," explained Jar, "for the Mesops of Luana are always at war with us, and would steal them if they found them." He nodded toward an island farther out at sea, and at so great a distance that it seemed but a blur hanging in the distant sky. The upward curve of the surface of Pellucidar was constantly revealing the impossible to the surprised eyes of the outer earthly. To see land and water curving upward in the distance until it seemed to stand on edge where it melted into the distant sky, and to feel that seas and mountains hung suspended directly above one's head required such a complete reversal of the perceptive and reasoning faculties as almost to stupefy one. No sooner had we hidden the canoe than Ja plunged into the jungle, presently emerging into a narrow but well-defined trail which wound hither and thither after the manner of the highways of all primitive folk. But there was one peculiarity about this Mesop trail which I was later to find distinguished them from all other trails that I ever have seen within or without the earth. It would run on, plain and clear and well-defined, to end suddenly in the midst of a tangle of matted jungle. Then Ja would turn directly back in his tracks for a little distance, spring into a tree, climb through it to the other side, drop onto a fallen log, leap over a low bush and alight once more upon a distinct trail, which he would follow back for a short distance, only to turn directly about and retrace his steps until after a mile or less this new pathway ended as suddenly and mysteriously as the former section. Then he would pass again across some media which would reveal no spoor, to take up the broken thread of the trail beyond. As the purpose of this remarkable avenue dawned upon me, I could not but admire the native shrewdness of the ancient progenitor of the Mesops, who hit upon this novel plan to throw his enemies from his track and delay or thwart them in their attempts to follow him to his deep-buried cities. To you of the outer earth it might seem a slow and tortuous method of traveling through the jungle, but were you of Pellucidar, you would realize that time is no factor where time does not exist. So labyrinthine are the windings of these trails, so varied the connecting links and the distances which one must retrace one's steps from the path's ends to find them, that a Mesop often reaches man's estate before he is familiar even with those which lead from his own city to the sea. In fact, 3/4 of the education of the young male Mesop consists in familiarizing himself with these jungle avenues, and the status of an adult is largely determined by the number of trails which he can follow upon his own island. The females never learn them, since from birth to death they never leave the clearing in which the village of their nativity is situated, except they be taken to mate by a male from another village, or captured in war by the enemies of their tribe. After proceeding through the jungle for what must have been upward of 5 miles, we emerged suddenly into a large clearing in the exact center of which stood as strange an appearing village as one might well imagine. Large trees had been chopped down 15 or 20 feet above the ground, and upon the tops of them spherical habitations of woven twigs, mud-covered, had been built. Each ball-like house was surmounted by some manner of carven image, which Ja told me indicated the identity of the owner. Horizontal slits 6 inches high and 2 or 3 feet wide served to admit light and ventilation. The entrances to the house were through small apertures in the bases of the trees, and thence upward by rude ladders through the hollow trunks to the rooms above. The houses varied in size from 2 to several rooms. The largest that I entered was divided into 2 floors and 8 apartments. All about the village, between it and the jungle, lay beautifully cultivated fields in which the Mesops raised such cereals, fruits and vegetables as they required. Women and children were working in these gardens as we crossed toward the village. At sight of Ja, they saluted deferentially, but to me they paid not the slightest attention. Among them, and about the outer verge of the cultivated area, were many warriors. These too saluted Ja by touching the points of their spears to the ground directly before them. Ja conducted me to a large house in the center of the village, the house with 8 rooms, and taking me up into it, gave me food and drink. There I met his mate, a comely girl with a nursing baby in her arms. Ja told her of how I had saved his life, and she was thereafter most kind and hospitable toward me, even permitting me to hold and amuse the tiny bundle of humanity whom Jar told me would one day rule the tribe, for Jar, it seemed, was the chief of the community. We had eaten and rested, and I had slept, much to Jar's amusement, for it seemed that he seldom, if ever, did so, and then the red man proposed that I accompany him to the temple of the Mahas, which lay not far from his village. "We are not supposed to visit it," he said, "but the great ones cannot hear, and if we keep well out of sight, they need never know that we have been there. For my part, I hate them, and always have, but the other chieftains of the island think it best that we continue to maintain the amicable relations which exist between the two races. Otherwise, I should like nothing better than to lead my warriors amongst the hideous creatures and exterminate them. Pellucidar would be a better place to live were there none of them." I wholly concurred in Jar's belief, but it seemed that it might be a difficult matter to exterminate the dominant race of Pellucidar. Thus conversing, we followed the intricate trail toward the temple, which we came upon in a small clearing surrounded by enormous trees similar to those which must have flourished upon the outer crust during the Carboniferous Age. Here was a mighty temple of hewn rock, built in the shape of a rough oval with rounded roof, in which were several large openings. No doors or windows were visible in the sides of the structure, nor was there need of any, except one entrance for the slaves, since, as Jar explained, the Mahas flew to and from their place of ceremonial, entering and leaving the building by means of the apertures in the roof. "But," added Jar, "there is an entrance near the base of which even the Mahas know nothing. Come." And he led me across the clearing and about the end to a pile of loose rock which lay against the foot of the wall. Here he removed a couple of large boulders, revealing a small opening which led straight within the building, or so it seemed, though, as I entered after Jar, I discovered myself in a narrow place of extreme darkness. "We are within the outer wall," said Jar. "It is hollow. Follow me closely." The red man groped ahead a few paces, and then began to ascend a primitive ladder similar to that which leads from the ground to the upper stories of his house. We ascended for some 40 feet, when the interior of the space between the walls commenced to grow lighter, and presently we came opposite an opening in the inner wall, which gave us an unobstructed view of the entire interior of the temple. The lower floor was an enormous tank of clear water in which numerous hideous Mahas swam lazily up and down. Artificial islands of granite rock dotted this artificial sea, and upon several of them I saw men and women like myself. "What are the human beings doing here?" I asked. "Wait, and you shall see," replied Jar. "They are to take a leading part in the ceremonies which will follow the advent of the Queen. You may be thankful that you are not upon the same side of the wall as they." Scarcely had he spoken than we heard a great fluttering of wings above, and a moment later a long procession of the frightful reptiles of Pellucidar winged slowly and majestically through the large central opening in the roof and circled in stately manner about the temple. There were several Mahas first, and then at least 20 awe-inspiring pterodactyls. Thipdars, they are called within Pellucidar. Behind these came the Queen, flanked by other Thipdars as she had been when she entered the amphitheatre at Phutra. 3 times they wheeled about the interior of the oval chamber to settle finally upon the damp, cold boulders that fringe the outer edge of the pool. In the centre of one side, the largest rock was reserved for the Queen, and here she took her place surrounded by her terrible guard. All lay quiet for several minutes after settling to their places. One might have imagined them in silent prayer. The poor slaves upon the diminutive islands watched the horrid creatures with wide eyes. The men, for the most part, stood erect and stately with folded arms, awaiting their doom, but the women and children clung to one another, hiding behind the males. They are a noble-looking race, these cavemen of Pellucidar, and if our progenitors were as they, the human race of the outer crust has deteriorated rather than improved with the march of the ages. All they lack is opportunity. We have opportunity and little else. Now the Queen moved. She raised her ugly head, looking about. Then, very slowly, she crawled to the edge of her throne and slid noiselessly into the water. Up and down the long tank she swam, turning at the ends as you have seen captive seals turn in their tiny tanks, turning upon their backs and diving below the surface. Nearer and nearer to the island she came, until at last she remained at rest before the largest, which was directly opposite her throne. Raising her hideous head from the water, she fixed her great round eyes upon the slaves. They were fat and sleek, for they had been brought from a distant Mahar city, where human beings are kept in droves, and bred and fattened as we breed and fatten beef cattle. The queen fixed her gaze upon a plump young maiden. Her victim tried to turn away, hiding her face in her hands and kneeling behind a woman, but the reptile, with unblinking eyes, stared on with such fixity that I could have sworn her vision penetrated the girl's arms to reach at last the very center of her brain. Slowly the reptile's head commenced to move to and fro, but the eyes never ceased to bore toward the frightened girl, and then the victim responded. She turned wide, fear-haunted eyes toward the Mahar Queen. Slowly she rose to her feet, and then, as though dragged by some unseen power, she moved as one in a trance straight toward the reptile, her glassy eyes fixed upon those of her captor. To the water's edge she came, nor did she even pause, but stepped into the shallows beside the little island. On she moved toward the Mahar, who now slowly retreated, as though leading her victim on. The water rose to the girl's knees, and still she advanced, chained by that clammy eye. Now the water was at her waist, now her armpits. Her fellows upon the island looked on in horror, helpless to avert her doom, in which they saw a forecast of their own. The Mahar sank now, till only the long upper bill and eyes were exposed above the surface of the water, and the girl had advanced until the end of that repulsive beak was but an inch or two from her face, her horror-filled eyes riveted upon those of the reptile. Now the water passed above the girl's mouth and nose, her eyes and forehead all that showed, yet still she walked on after the retreating Mahar. The queen's head slowly disappeared beneath the surface, and after it went the eyes of her victim. Only a slow ripple widened toward the shores to mark where the two vanished. For a time all was silence within the temple. The slaves were motionless in terror. The Mahars watched the surface of the water for the reappearance of their queen, and presently at one end of the tank her head rose slowly into view. She was backing toward the surface, her eyes fixed before her as they had been when she dragged the helpless girl to her doom. And then, to my utter amazement, I saw the forehead and eyes of the maiden come slowly out of the depths, following the gaze of the reptile, just as when she had disappeared beneath the surface. On and on came the girl until she stood in water that reached barely to her knees, and though she had been beneath the surface sufficient time to have drowned her thrice over, there was no indication, other than her dripping hair and glistening body, that she had been submerged at all. Again and again the queen led the girl into the depths and out again, until the uncanny weirdness of the thing got on my nerves, so that I could have leaped into the tank to the child's rescue had I not taken a firm hold of myself. Once they were below much longer than usual, and when they came to the surface I was horrified to see that one of the girl's arms was gone, gnawed completely off at the shoulder. But the poor thing gave no indication of realizing pain, only the horror in her set eyes seemed intensified. The next time they appeared the other arm was gone, and then the breasts, and then a part of the face. It was awful. The poor creatures on the islands, awaiting their fate, tried to cover their eyes with their hands to hide the fearful sight. But now I saw that they too were under the hypnotic spell of the reptiles, so that they could only crouch in terror with their eyes fixed upon the terrible thing that was transpiring before them. Finally the queen was under much longer than ever before, and when she rose she came alone and swam sleepily toward her boulder. The moment she mounted it seemed to be the signal for the other Mahars to enter the tank, and then commenced upon a larger scale a repetition of the uncanny performance through which the queen had led her victim. Only the women and children fell prey to the Mahars, they being the weakest and most tender. And when they had satisfied their appetite for human flesh, some of them devouring 2 and 3 of the slaves, there were only a score of full-grown men left, and I thought that for some reason these were to be spared, but such was far from the case, for as the last Mahar crawled to her rock, the Queen's thipdars darted into the air, circled the temple once, and then, hissing like steam engines, swooped down upon the remaining slaves. There was no hypnotism here, just the plain, brutal ferocity of the beast of prey, tearing, rending, and gulping its meat, but at that it was less horrible than the uncanny method of the Mahars. By the time the thipdars had disposed of the last of the slaves, the Mahars were all asleep upon their rocks, and a moment later the great pterodactyls swung back to their posts beside the Queen, and themselves dropped into slumber. "I thought the Mahars seldom, if ever, slept," I said to Jar. "They do many things in this temple which they do not do elsewhere," he replied. "The Mahars of Phutra are not supposed to eat human flesh, yet slaves are brought here by thousands, and almost always you will find Mahars on hand to consume them. I imagine that they do not bring their Sagoths here, because they are ashamed of the practice, which is supposed to obtain only among the least advanced of their race. But I would wager my canoe against a broken paddle that there is no Mahar, but it eats human flesh whenever she can get it." "Why should they object to eating human flesh?" I asked. "If it is true that they look upon us as lower animals? It is not because they consider us their equals that they are supposed to look with abhorrence upon those who eat our flesh," replied Jar. "It is merely that we are warm-blooded animals. They would not think of eating the meat of a thag, which we consider such a delicacy, any more than I would think of eating a snake. As a matter of fact, it is difficult to explain just why this sentiment should exist among them. I wonder if they left a single victim," I remarked, leaning far out of the opening in the rocky wall to inspect the temple better. Directly below me, the water lapped the very side of the wall, there being a break in the boulders at this point, as there was at several other places about the side of the temple. My hands were resting upon a small piece of granite which formed a part of the wall, and all my weight upon it proved too much for it. It slipped, and I lunged forward. There was nothing to save myself, and I plunged head foremost into the water below. Fortunately, the tank was deep at this point, and I suffered no injury from the fall. But as I was rising to the surface, my mind filled with the horrors of my position as I thought of the terrible doom which awaited me the moment the eyes of the reptiles fell upon the creature that had disturbed their slumber. As long as I could, I remained beneath the surface, swimming rapidly in the direction of the islands that I might prolong my life to the utmost. At last I was forced to rise for air, and as I cast a terrified glance in the direction of the Mahars and the thipdars, I was almost stunned to see that not a single one remained upon the rocks where I had last seen them, nor, as I searched the temple with my eyes, could I discern any within it. For a moment I was puzzled to account for the thing, until I realized that the reptiles, being deaf, could not have been disturbed by the noise my body made when it hit the water, and that as there is no such thing as time within Pellucidar, there was no telling how long I had been beneath the surface. It was a difficult thing to attempt to figure out by earthly standards, this matter of elapsed time, but when I set myself to it, I began to realize that I might have been submerged a second or a month, or not at all. You have no conception of the strange contradictions and impossibilities which arise when all methods of measuring time, as we know them upon earth, are non-existent. I was about to congratulate myself upon the miracle which had saved me for the moment, when the memory of the hypnotic powers of the Mahars filled me with apprehension, lest they be practicing their uncanny art upon me to the end that I merely imagined that I was alone in the temple. At the thought, cold sweat broke out upon me from every pore, and as I crawled from the water onto one of the tiny islands, I was trembling like a leaf. You cannot imagine the awful horror which even the simple thought of the repulsive horrors of Pellucidar induces in the human mind, and to feel that you are in their power, that they are crawling, slimy and abhorrent, to drag you down beneath the waters and devour you. It is frightful. But they did not come, and at last I came to the conclusion that I was indeed alone within the temple. How long I should be alone was the next question to assail me as I swam frantically about once more in search of a means to escape. Several times I called to Jar, but he must have left after I tumbled into the tank, for I received no response to my cries. Doubtless he had felt as certain of my doom when he saw me topple from our hiding place as I had, and lest he too should be discovered, had hastened from the temple and back to his village. I knew that there must be some entrance to the building beside the doorways in the roof, for it did not seem reasonable to believe that the thousands of slaves which were brought here to feed the Mahas the human flesh they craved would all be carried through the air. And so I continued my search until at last it was rewarded by the discovery of several loose granite blocks in the masonry at one end of the temple. A little effort proved sufficient to dislodge enough of these stones to permit me to crawl through into the clearing, and a moment later I had scurried across the intervening space to the dense jungle beyond. Here I sank panting and trembling upon the matted grasses beneath the giant trees, for I felt that I had escaped from the grinning fangs of death out of the depths of my own grave. Whatever dangers lay hidden in this island jungle, there could be none so fearsome as those which I had just escaped. I knew that I could meet death bravely enough if it but came in the form of some familiar beast or man, anything other than the hideous and uncanny Mahas.